The gate was rusted shut. Not slightly rusted, not sticky from disuse. It was sealed by years of neglect, the iron hinges so thick with red-brown corrosion that the metal had almost become part of the stone pillar beside it. Clara Webb stood in front of it with her one traveling bag at her feet and a folder of papers tucked under her arm, and she stared at the gate the way a person stares at something they were not told to expect. The letter had said the North Estate was large and historic. It had said the grounds were extensive. It had called the position a role of considerable responsibility requiring an independent spirit. Clara had read that phrase 3 times on the train ride north, turning it over in her mind like a coin she was not sure was genuine. Considerable responsibility, independent spirit. Those were the kinds of phrases people used when what they actually meant was, there is no one else to help you, and the thing we are sending you to manage is more broken than we are willing to say in writing. She was 29 years old. She had spent 6 years working under Lord Hargrove's estate manager in the South, a methodical, sharp-eyed man named Fletcher who had taught her everything she knew about managing land, accounts, staff, and the particular kind of pride that old families carried around their properties like a second coat. She had been good at her work, better than good. She had been the person Fletcher consulted when something went wrong, the person who stayed late without being asked, the person who quietly fixed problems before they became large enough for anyone important to notice. She had believed, with the quiet certainty of someone who has earned a thing, that when Fletcher retired at the end of the year, she would be offered his position. Instead, she had been called into Lord Hargrove's study on a Tuesday morning, offered a chair she had sat in perhaps twice before, and told that her work had been exemplary, truly outstanding. He had used the word outstanding twice. Then he had explained that the stewardship of the southern estate would be going to a man named Clifford Hale, a pleasant fellow, Lord Hargrove had said, a solid choice, very well connected, and that for Clara he had something perhaps even more interesting. The North Estate, Lord Ashworth's property, largely unmanaged for the past several years. A wonderful opportunity, he had said, for someone with her particular abilities. She had thanked him politely and left the room and walked directly to the garden and stood there for 11 minutes in the cold air until she trusted herself to speak to anyone again. The North Estate, she had asked around carefully. People answered carefully too. The North Estate was far. Lord Ashworth was rarely in residence, had not been there in years by some accounts. The estate had gone through 3 managers in the past decade, none of whom had stayed long. One person told her with practiced lightness that it was a beautiful part of the country if you liked grey skies and wind. Another simply said, "I am sorry, Clara," which told her more than any of the careful answers. Clifford Hale was Lord Hargrove's nephew by marriage. She had not known that until the day she packed her bag. She lifted the latch of the gate again and pushed hard. It gave this time, grinding and scraping against the stone path beneath, and swung inward with a sound like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time finally letting it out. Clara picked up her bag and walked through. The drive curved away from the gate and disappeared around a slope of overgrown hedging. The gravel had been swallowed mostly by weeds, tall, determined things that had pushed up through the stones until the path was more green than gray. On either side, what had once been an approach of planted trees stood as a row of tall shapes that had grown entirely without direction, their lower branches tangling across the path, their upper branches meeting overhead in a canopy of gray-brown wood. It was mid-autumn. The leaves were already mostly gone. Clara walked the full length of the drive, which took about 4 minutes at a measured pace. She counted the broken fence posts along the left-hand side. There were 7. She noted that the drainage ditch running alongside the path was completely blocked. She observed that someone had at some point planted rose bushes along the right side of the drive, and that those rose bushes had not been pruned in what looked like many years, and had grown into dense, thorn tangles that reached out across the path at knee-height. By the time she reached the house itself, she had already begun a list in her head. It was a long list. The house was made of pale stone that had gone dark with damp and time. It was 3 stories high, with wide windows that looked out across the front grounds, and a large wooden door at the center that was at least presentable. Someone had kept it painted, or had painted it not too many years ago. There was a stone step in front of the door that had been swept. Clara noticed that. The step had been swept. That meant someone was here. She knocked. The woman who opened the door was in her mid-60s, small and neatly dressed, with white hair pulled tightly back and the kind of face that had settled into permanent watchfulness, the way a house settles into its foundations, not without warmth, but not quickly giving it either. She looked at Clara with the careful attention of someone assessing a new thing before deciding what to make of it. "You'll be the new manager," she said. It was not a question. "Clara Webb," Clara said. "You must be Mrs. Polly." The woman opened the door wider. "Come in, you'll want tea. The fire in the sitting room is going. George lit it this morning when we got word you were coming." The inside of the house smelled of old wood and coal smoke, and something faintly floral, some dried herb hung somewhere, or a long-ago bunch of lavender that had left its trace in the walls. Clara followed Mrs. Polly through a front hall that was clean but cold, past a staircase that swept upward in a graceful curve, and into a sitting room where a fire was indeed burning, and where a man of about 70 sat in a chair close to it, reading a newspaper with the concentration of someone who has learned that concentration keeps the cold out. He looked up when they came in. He had a broad, weather-browned face, grey stubble, and hands that were large and work-worn in the way of a man who has spent his life outdoors. He folded the newspaper and stood up. "George Polly," he said, "I keep the grounds what I can." Those last 3 words carried the weight of everything Clara had been carefully told and not told. She shook his hand. "I'm very glad to meet you both," she said, and she meant it completely because these 2 people had stayed when others had not, and that told her something important about them. "I'd like tea, please, and then I'd like you to show me everything, not just the house, everything, whatever is in the best condition and whatever is in the worst. I need to see it all." Mrs. Polly went to make the tea. George Polly looked at her for a moment with something shifting in his expression, something that might have been surprise or relief or a very guarded form of hope. He nodded. "It'll take a while," he said. "Good," Clara said. "I am in no hurry." That was not entirely true. She was in a very specific kind of hurry, the private, determined kind that does not announce itself but never stops. She had 3 months before the ground froze. She had a list already forming. She had precisely the amount of money that Lord Ashworth's estate account contained, which she had confirmed before leaving. It was not generous, but it was not nothing. And she had the plain, solid, unspectacular skill of knowing how to look at a broken thing and figure out where to start. She drank her tea standing up. George watched her. "You'll want to start with the grounds," he said, "not the house." "Yes," Clara said. He looked at her again. The guarded hope in his expression grew slightly less guarded. "Most people start with the house," he said. "Most people are wrong," Clara said. He picked up his coat from the hook by the sitting room door. He put it on. He opened the door that led to the back of the house and the estate grounds beyond, and the cold came in with the smell of wet soil and dead leaves and distance, and Clara pulled her own coat tighter and stepped through. The North Estate was, she found over the next 2 hours, simultaneously larger and more ruined than she had imagined. The formal gardens at the front of the house, which from old photographs in estate records she would later find had once been a source of some regional pride, were buried under a decade of unchecked growth. The borders had lost all shape. The rose beds had gone wild. The paths that connected the different sections of the garden had cracked and heaved, and in some places were invisible entirely under moss and weed. The kitchen garden at the rear, meant to supply the household with vegetables and herbs, had been kept up to some rough working standard by George, who had kept a few beds going mostly out of habit and the practical need to have fresh vegetables. Those beds were neat and cared for, a small island of order in a wider sea of neglect, and they told Clara exactly the kind of man George Polly was. He had kept what he could. He had not given up on the things he could still control. Beyond the kitchen garden was a long slope of grass that descended toward a stone wall at the property's northern edge. The wall was intact. The grass was rough but manageable. On either side of the slope were what had once been planted borders. She could see the evidence of them even now, the faint structural bones of things that had once grown with intention, the remnants of planting that had been done by someone who knew what they were doing and had done it with care. George walked beside her in silence most of the time. When she asked questions, he answered them directly, without decoration. The fountain on the east side had stopped working 6 years ago. The glass house along the south wall had a broken pane that he had patched with wood because he hadn't been given money for glass. The 2 trees that had fallen across the western path after a storm 2 winters ago were still lying where they had fallen because he hadn't been able to move them alone. Each answer landed in Clara's mind and took its place in the growing list. "Why did the others leave?" she asked. She asked it simply and directly, not looking at him, watching instead where she stepped on the broken garden path. George was quiet for a moment. First one couldn't stand the quiet, he said. Second one kept waiting for Lord Ashworth to send instructions, waited long enough that he forgot to manage anything. Third one decided pretty quickly it wasn't worth the effort. Was it quiet that drove them or something else? It gets into you, George said, a place this far gone. Some people look at it and see the size of the problem, and that's all they see. Clara stopped walking. She looked out across the slope of rough grass toward the far stone wall, and then she turned and looked back at the house, pale stone, dark windows, the bare trees of the avenue standing on either side of it. The sky above was the particular shade of gray that comes just before the cold really sets in, the kind of gray that makes the whole world feel like it is waiting. She looked at all of it for a long moment. "Show me the walled garden," she said, "the one on the east side behind the yew hedge." George looked at her. "How do you know about that?" "I can see the top of the wall from here. It's older than the rest of the boundary. It was built first. There's usually a kitchen garden inside walls like that." "Garden," George said, "used to be. It's been locked for quite a few years. Mrs. Polly has the key. She kept it because no one told her not to, and she wasn't about to let the last good key on this estate disappear." They walked back toward the house. Clara did not say anything else. She was thinking about the length of the locked wall, the height of it, taller than the surrounding boundary by a full 2 feet, built to hold warmth, built with care, not a kitchen garden then, something more considered. Mrs. Polly produced the key from a hook in the kitchen without being asked, simply reading something in Clara's face and George's walk that told her where they were going. She held it out. It was old iron, large, the kind of key that people made when they expected a thing to last. The lock in the walled garden door was stiff but not seized. Clara turned the key twice, the second time with both hands, and pushed the door open and stepped in. What she saw stopped her mid-step. The walled garden was large, larger than she had guessed from outside. The walls enclosed a space perhaps 40 feet by 60, the stone walls on all 4 sides running 8 feet high, south-facing, built to trap every degree of warmth the thin northern sun could provide. The beds inside were raised, the original structures still visible, stone-edged paths still findable beneath the weeds. There were the remains of trained trees against the walls, espaliers. She could see the wire frames still attached to the stone, and against the southern wall the ghost of something that had once been planted with great care, the root structures still there below the surface, dormant but alive. And on every wall in the mortar between the stones there were small iron hooks, dozens of them, the kind used for running wires, for training climbing plants, for creating a vertical canvas of growing things. Someone had installed them by the hundreds, at intervals so precise they must have been measured and planned and cared about deeply. Clara stood in the middle of the walled garden and turned slowly, looking at all of it. Behind her, George Polly stood in the doorway. "No one's been in here since Lady Ashworth passed," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. Clara turned and looked at him. "When was that?" 11 years ago." Clara looked back at the iron hooks on the walls, the care in them, the hundreds of small deliberate decisions they represented. She breathed in the smell of cold soil and something underneath it, the faint ghost of what had once grown here, caught in the stone and released when the door opened. "Right," she said. She stepped further in. The weeds in the walled garden were deep-rooted and established, but the soil beneath them was dark and rich, protected by the walls from the worst of the northern wind, composted for years by the very things growing in it. Clara knelt and put her hand into the soil near the base of the south wall. It was the best soil she had felt since she arrived, better than the open borders, better than the kitchen garden. This place had been fed and tended for years before it was abandoned, and the earth had a long memory. She stood up and brushed her hands together. "I need," she said quietly, still looking at the south wall, "a full set of estate records from the past 20 years. The planting records, the purchase ledgers, the household accounts, whatever exists." "Mrs. Polly keeps the records," George said. "She'll have them. She kept everything." "Good." Clara pulled her coat closer around her against the cold that the walled garden trapped as faithfully as warmth. "And I need to know," she said, "who planted this garden originally, not what they grew, who they were." George looked at her for a long time from the doorway. "You'd best ask Mrs. Polly that too," he said. "There's things better explained over tea." Clara took one more long look at the iron hooks on the walls. All those small, careful, deliberate gestures. All that intention preserved in metal and stone, while the garden itself had gone to seed around it. She would find out who had planted it, she would find out what had grown here. And then she was going to bring it back, not because anyone had asked her to, and not because it would make anyone look at her differently, and not because it would prove a point to the people who had sent her here as though north were a word for punishment. She was going to bring it back because the garden deserved it, because the iron hooks deserved it, because the dark, rich soil under the weeds was simply too good to leave wasted. Clara Webb walked back out of the walled garden, pulled the door shut behind her, and asked Mrs. Polly where the records were kept. The records room was behind the kitchen, through a narrow door that Clara had to duck slightly to pass through, into a space that was cool and dry and smelled of old paper and cedar. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 of the 4 walls. Every shelf was full. Mrs. Polly stood in the doorway with her arms folded, watching Clara's face as she looked at the shelves. "I organized them by year," Mrs. Polly said, planting records on the left, financial accounts in the middle, household and correspondence on the right, from 1961 to the present, such as the present is. Clara turned to look at her. "You organized all of this yourself?" "Someone had to," Mrs. Polly said it without pride and without complaint, the way a person states a simple fact. "The second manager, the one who waited for instructions, he threw some things out. I retrieved what I could from the bin in the yard before the rain got to it. After that, I started keeping the records myself." Clara looked back at the shelves. What did he throw out? Some of the older planting records, the 50s and early 60s, he said they were irrelevant. They were not irrelevant. No, Mrs. Polly agreed, they were not. Clara pulled the first box from the left-hand shelf, Planting Records, 1975, and carried it to the small table in the center of the room. She sat down and opened it. Inside were handwritten ledgers, their pages covered in a small, precise handwriting that slanted slightly to the right. The entries were methodical: date, section of garden, what was planted, where it was sourced, observations after 2 weeks, observations after a month. Every page was dense with this careful notation. "Whose handwriting is this?" Clara asked. Mrs. Polly came into the room properly for the first time and stood beside the table and looked at the page Clara had opened. "Lady Ashworth's," she said. "Eleanor Ashworth. She started keeping the records herself in the early 70s when the original head gardener retired. She said the records had been inconsistent and she wanted them done properly." Clara turned another page. The handwriting continued, the same precise care, notation after notation. Someone who had taken this seriously. Someone who had treated the garden not as a decorative feature of the estate, but as a thing that required honest, careful attention. "She managed the gardens herself?" Clara asked. "Managed, planned, planted, much of it, yes. She had a local man who helped with the heavy work, George's predecessor, but the vision was hers. Everything you see in this estate that was once beautiful came from her." Clara reached for the box from 1978 and found the records for the walled garden specifically, a full section of the ledger dedicated to it, with sketches in the margins showing planting layouts and wall coverage diagrams. Lady Ashworth had drawn everything. The sketched plans were done with care, dimensioned, annotated. They showed a garden of remarkable ambition. Climbing roses trained to all 4 walls, an inner planting of medicinal herbs arranged by height, 2 trained fruit trees against the south-facing wall, and in the very center, a circular bed that the notes described only as the scent garden, to be completed in stages. Clara sat with those pages for a long time. "She was very skilled," Clara said. "She was extraordinary," Mrs. Polly said, and there was something in her voice that was not entirely steady, and then it was steady again. "She died in the spring 11 years ago, quickly. It was not expected." Clara closed the ledger. She pulled the boxes from the shelves around the walled garden section of the years, 1980, 1982, 1985, and laid them out on the table. She did not ask more questions about Lady Ashworth's death. She could see what the death had meant in the records themselves, a detailed living document that simply stopped mid-page with an entry dated April and then nothing after it. Blank pages, then the years of silence in which the garden had quietly come undone. She worked through the records for 3 hours, making her own notes. By the time Mrs. Polly brought supper, a plain, good meal of soup and bread, Clara had a clear picture of what the walled garden had once been and a rough understanding of what would be needed to bring it back. It was more than she had hoped and less than she had feared. The bones were good, the soil was good, the wall structures were sound, George had confirmed. The wire frames for the espaliers were still attached, rusted but structurally intact. The climbing roses against the walls had not died, they had simply not been pruned in 11 years, which meant they were a chaos of old wood and young growth, but the root systems were enormous and healthy. She would not be planting from nothing. She would be working with something that had endured stubbornly through years of being ignored. That felt to Clara like something she understood. She spent her first full week at the North Estate in assessment mode, walking every section of the grounds with a notebook, measuring, recording, looking. She walked the boundary walls. She measured the drainage ditches. She pulled back weeds at random intervals to look at the soil beneath. She climbed the wooden ladder in the glass house and inspected the roof panes, counting which were cracked and which had simply shifted in their frames. George accompanied her for some of this, not all of it. He watched her from a distance on some mornings, leaning on a fence post with his arms folded, saying nothing. Clara noticed this but did not comment on it. She understood it. He was deciding whether she was real. She had seen this before, the wariness of someone who has watched too many people arrive with good intentions and leave when the difficulty became clear. She did not try to convince George she was different. She simply continued doing the work, and let the work speak for whatever needed to be said. On the 7th day she sat down and wrote her first formal assessment of the estate's condition. She wrote it honestly. She did not soften the state of the formal gardens or downplay the amount of work the walled garden would require. She wrote the cost she expected and the timeline she thought was realistic. And at the end of the assessment she wrote her priorities in order: drainage first, because without that nothing else would grow properly. Then the walled garden, because it had the best conditions and the most intact structure. Then the formal borders along the front of the house, because those were visible from the road and their improvement would be noticed. She sent the assessment to Lord Ashworth's London address, as she had been instructed to do for all formal correspondence. She did not expect a quick response. She did not receive one. She started on the drainage the following morning. The drainage system along the north side of the estate had failed at 2 points: a collapsed section of clay pipe and a blocked culvert that had been causing water to back up across the lower part of the grounds for at least 2 or 3 years. Judging by the saturation of the soil and the particular type of water-loving weeds that had taken over the area. Clara ordered the materials from the nearest town, negotiated a fair price, and spent the better part of a week working alongside George and a hired man from the village. A quiet, efficient young man named Patrick who showed up each morning exactly on time and worked steadily until dark. George thawed toward her on the 2nd day of the drainage work. She noticed it happen. She was kneeling in the ditch beside Patrick, checking the level of a new pipe section, when she looked up and saw George watching her with an expression that was no longer quite so carefully neutral. He was not smiling, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that was different from the beginning of the week. That evening, over supper, he told her about the glass house without her asking. He told her which pane needed replacing first, and that there was a glass supplier in the next town he had used before and trusted, and that the previous managers had never bothered to use them. She wrote down the supplier's name and thanked him. Mrs. Polly, for her part, had been warm from the beginning, had offered tea and meals, and had answered every question Clara asked. But there was a layer of reserve in her too, a watching and waiting quality that Clara recognized as the other side of grief. Mrs. Polly had loved Lady Ashworth, that was clear in everything she said, and how she said it and how she said nothing. The estate in its current neglected state was a daily reminder of that loss. Every broken path and overgrown border was evidence of what had been taken. She had stayed because leaving would have felt like a second abandonment. Clara did not know how to speak to that directly, so she spoke through action. She began ordering seed catalogs. She spread them on the kitchen table in the evenings and worked through them systematically, cross-referencing with Lady Ashworth's old planting records to identify which varieties had been grown in the walled garden and whether they could still be sourced. Some of them were old varieties, heritage roses, heirloom herbs that had fallen out of mainstream commercial availability. Those took more searching. She wrote letters to specialist nurseries. She spent 2 evenings on the telephone with a heritage rose grower in Yorkshire who was initially suspicious of her interest, but became, over the course of a long and detailed conversation about cultivation methods, genuinely helpful. Mrs. Polly came into the kitchen on the 3rd evening to find Clara with her notes and catalogues spread across the table, and a cold cup of tea at her elbow. She sat down across from Clara and picked up the open catalogue and looked at the page Clara had been marking. "The climbing Bourbon roses," Mrs. Polly said. "Lady Ashworth had 3 of those against the north wall of the walled garden." "I know," Clara said. "I found them in the 1981 records. They're still there, technically. They need a great deal of work." She was very particular about those. Mrs. Polly set the catalogue down. She was quiet for a moment. She had them sent from a grower in France. The man who ran it retired and the business closed. She was worried for years that if she ever lost them, she wouldn't be able to replace them. "They're alive," Clara said. "The root systems are intact. They just need cutting back and proper feeding. I've found a grower who carries the same variety. They're based in Yorkshire. I've already been in contact." Mrs. Polly looked at her. For a moment, the reserve in her face moved aside like a curtain briefly pulled back, and what was behind it was something raw and tired and real. "You've been here 9 days," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "And you're already looking for the French roses." "They were a priority," Clara said simply. Mrs. Polly looked down at the catalogue for a moment. When she looked up, her expression had settled back into its usual careful composure, but it was a fraction softer than it had been. "I'll make fresh tea," she said. "That cup is stone cold." Clara did not ask for the soft answer behind the practical offer. She simply moved the catalogues to make room and said thank you. The 4th week brought rain. Hard, sustained northern rain that turned the grounds to mud and reduced visibility to gray sheets of water and made almost all outdoor work impossible. Patrick stayed home. George moved between the house and the glass house in his waterproof coat, checking on what needed checking. Clara used the time to go deeper into the records room. She pulled the boxes from the early 70s, before Lady Ashworth had taken over the record-keeping herself. The records from that period were kept by the then head gardener, a man named Harold whose handwriting was large and blunt and whose entries were sparse but useful. She could see in them the earlier shape of the garden before Lady Ashworth's vision had transformed it. Good bones, even then. The basic structure of the formal gardens, the walled garden itself, the avenue of trees leading to the gate, all of it had existed in some form for at least 100 years, the product of different hands and different eras, all building on and arguing with what came before. She was reading a planting record from 1968 when she found a loose sheet of paper tucked between 2 pages. It had fallen out of a different ledger and been misplaced or simply forgotten. It was a hand-drawn plan of the walled garden, but not Lady Ashworth's drawing style. This was older, the lines more formal, done with a draftsman's precision rather than a gardener's. It showed the walled garden as it had been planned originally, and in the lower right corner in a formal slanted hand were the words, "The North Garden for warmth and fragrance, a private space." Clara held the paper carefully. She looked at the date in the corner, 1903. Someone had built the walled garden in 1903, had planned it deliberately and precisely and had described it in those 4 words, "for warmth and fragrance, a private space." The rain hammered the roof of the records room. Clara sat with the old plan on the table in front of her and felt the full weight of the years it represented, all the hands that had added to this place, all the people who had loved it in different ways and at different times, all the mornings and seasons and deliberate choices layered on top of each other in the soil and the stone and the iron hooks in the walls. She thought of Lord Hargrove in his study, the careful phrasing, the word outstanding said twice, Clifford Hale and his connections. She thought of the rusted gate, the broken drain, the walled garden locked for 11 years with its roses alive inside it and no one to tend them. Then she picked up her pen and began making notes about what the original 1903 plan told her about the garden's structure, because the drawing showed a detail she had not been able to see clearly under the overgrowth. The south wall had not 1 but 2 planting tiers. There was a raised bed along its base that she had partially uncovered during her first walk through but had not fully understood. It was designed to catch runoff heat from the wall above during the night. She would need to excavate that raised bed carefully. Whatever root systems were in it were old and potentially valuable. She added it to the list. The rain kept falling. Clara kept writing. By the end of the 4th week, her notebook was half full and the list had grown to 4 pages, and the first drainage repairs were complete, and the soil in the north lower field was beginning, very slowly, to recover. She wrote her second report to Lord Ashworth's London address, progress on drainage, walled garden assessment complete, proposed planting schedule for spring enclosed, estimated budget for first phase. She did not write, The estate is extraordinary and should never have been left like this. She did not write, "I understand now why you have not come back." She wrote what was factual and clear and actionable. She sealed the envelope and gave it to Mrs. Polly to post, and went back out into the cold to look at the walled garden door and think about the planting schedule for the south wall tier. The response from Lord Ashworth's office came 6 days later. It was 3 lines. It said the budget had been reviewed and approved. It said the quarterly accounts should be submitted as usual. It said to address any further correspondence to his secretary, Mr. Lane. Clara read it once and put it in the correspondence file. She went back to work. The glass house became her evening retreat as winter deepened. After supper, when Mrs. Polly had gone to her room and George had retired to the cottage he kept at the edge of the property, Clara would put on her coat and take a lantern and walk across the dark garden to the glass house and spend an hour or 2 with her seedling trays and her notes. The new pane had been installed in the 2nd week. George had taken her to the supplier in town, introduced her with a brief nod as the new manager. She knows what she's about. And the supplier had accepted this endorsement as sufficient, and now the glass house held warmth properly for the first time in years. She had started seeds early, earlier than most people would have. But she knew the north short growing season demanded it, and she trusted the glass house's warmth and the grow lights she had ordered from the supplier's catalog. She grew her own seedlings because it was cheaper, and because she wanted to know exactly what she was putting into the ground. She labeled everything with neat paper tags written in the same small handwriting she used for her field notes. On a night in the 3rd month, while she was checking the moisture level of a tray of herb seedlings by the light of the lantern, she heard footsteps on the gravel path outside. She stood still. Then the glass house door opened and George came in, ducking slightly as he always did. He looked at the seedling trays. He looked at the labeled tags. He looked at the care with which everything was arranged. "Can't sleep," he said. It was not an explanation, just a fact. "Neither can I tonight," Clara said, which was also true. He pulled an upturned crate from beneath the potting bench and sat on it, which was something she had never seen him do. He was always standing, always at the edge of rooms, always in the posture of someone about to leave. Sitting down meant something. "My wife keeps the records," he said, meaning Mrs. Polly, as Clara had understood they were married from the beginning. She kept them because she couldn't keep anything else. After Lady Ashworth died, everything just went wrong fast. The family was in shock. Lord Ashworth went to London and never came back. The first manager lasted 8 months. "My wife kept the records to keep something going." Clara did not say anything. She waited. "Those planting records," George said, "the ones from the 80s. My wife watched Lady Ashworth write most of those entries. She used to sit in the records room with a cup of tea and do them on Sunday evenings after the week's work. My wife would bring the tea." Clara understood now why Mrs. Polly had been watchful about the records room, why she had organized it so carefully, why she had retrieved the pages from the bin in the yard. Those records were not just estate documents. They were the closest thing that remained to the person they had lost. "The walled garden," Clara said, "Lady Ashworth's garden. I want to restore it as close to her original design as possible. I've been working from her planting records and the 1903 plan. If there are things you or Mrs. Polly remember that aren't in the records, plants she particularly loved, things she tried that didn't work, details about how she arranged things, I would very much like to know them." George was quiet for a while. The lantern light moved slightly. "She grew sweet peas along the east wall every summer," he said. "Not in the records because she considered them temporary. She planted them fresh from seed each spring and trained them up strings she tied herself. The whole east wall smelled of them from June until September." Clara made a note. They sat in the glass house for another hour. George talked about the garden from memory, not systematically, but in the way a person speaks about a place they loved, in fragments and details, the particular smell of the walled garden on a summer morning, the way the south wall held the day's warmth long into the evening, so that standing near it after sunset felt like standing near something breathing. The sound the fountain made when it was working properly. The year the wisteria over the main garden gate first bloomed, and Lady Ashworth had brought everyone out to look at it, all of them standing there in the light looking up at the purple flowers as though they were seeing something rare. Clara filled 4 pages of her notebook. When George finally stood up and said good night, she watched him walk back across the dark garden toward his cottage. Then she looked back at her seedling trays and the careful labels, and she added a note at the top of the new page: Sweet peas, east wall strings, June to September. It would be in the garden next year. Everything Lady Ashworth had loved would be in the garden next year. The ground froze in the second week of December as Clara had known it would. The seedling trays in the glasshouse continued, warm and green and growing at their own pace, but outside the work shifted to the kind that cold weather permitted: clearing, planning, repairing the things that could be repaired without disturbing the earth. She and Patrick spent 3 days clearing the 2 fallen trees from the western path. Patrick brought his brother Oliver on the second day, a younger, quieter version of Patrick, who worked just as steadily and asked even fewer questions. Between the 4 of them, counting George who directed the work and operated the borrowed winch that belonged to a farmer down the road, they got both trees up and cut into sections that would do for firewood. By the time they were done, the western path was clear for the first time in 2 winters, and Clara could see from one end of it to the other, a long straight line through what had once been a section of the ornamental garden, lined on both sides with the stumps of low-growing shrubs that had been smothered by the fallen trees. She knelt and brushed the dead leaves from one of the stumps and looked at it carefully. Lavender. The whole western path had once been bordered by lavender. She could see it now: dozens of plants, most of them dead but a few at the far end, furthest from the fallen trees that had survived. They were old plants, woody at the base, unpruned for years but alive. She went back to Lady Ashworth's records that evening and found it in the 1983 ledger. Lavender, Western Walk, both sides, Hidcote variety, planted in 18-inch spacing. 46 plants on each side. She added lavender, Hidcote variety, 92 plants, to the spring order list. Winter brought a particular kind of quiet to the North Estate that Clara had not experienced in the South. The silence was different, bigger somehow, as though the cold had pushed the world further back and the estate sat in a space of its own, insulated from the rest of the county. She found that she did not mind it. She had expected to. The people who had warned her about the North, about the quiet, had not been wrong about the fact of it. They had just been wrong about whether it was something to dread. She walked the grounds every morning regardless of the weather, which George noted with a brief comment once and never mentioned again. She walked because the grounds showed her things she could only see with regular, patient attention. She found a spring seeping up from the ground near the east boundary wall, a small one, easily missed, but it explained the particular lushness of the moss in that corner, and suggested there was underground water moving through the property that she had not accounted for in her drainage calculations. She found the remains of an old hotbed frame near the kitchen garden, the wooden sides rotted but the stone base intact, which told her that someone had grown vegetables under glass in that spot historically, and that the spot was probably warmer than its surroundings. She found, on a clear January morning when the frost had hardened everything to silver, a set of stone steps she had not known were there, half buried in an overgrown bank at the back of the formal garden, 12 steps descending to a lower terrace that was entirely hidden from the upper level by the height of the bank. The lower terrace was perhaps 30 feet wide, south-facing, sheltered on 3 sides. The stone flags of the terrace were cracked and heaved by frost over many years, but were mostly intact. A low stone bench ran along the southern edge, and what had once been a planting bed along the base of the bank was packed with the dead stems of whatever had grown there last. Clara stood on the lower terrace in the frost and looked up at the bank and the upper garden above it, and then looked out across the view the terrace commanded, a long slope of fields below the estate's south boundary wall, the land rolling away to a line of bare winter trees on the horizon. She had not known this view existed. She had been on the estate for nearly 3 months and had not known this view existed, because the steps were hidden and the terrace was buried and no one had mentioned it. She pulled out her notebook and wrote, "Hidden lower terrace, south aspect, full view, excellent shelter, check records." Then she walked back up the bank to the kitchen, where Mrs. Polly was making bread, and she asked about it. Mrs. Polly turned from the counter with flour on her hands, and her face showed something that was briefly, unmistakably fond. "Lady Ashworth's reading terrace," she said. "She would have tea down there on fine days. She said the view was the best thing about the whole estate, and she refused to sit indoors and waste it." Clara looked at her notebook. The planting bed along the base of the bank, what was in it? Herbs mostly. Thyme, rosemary. She had a particular rosemary she'd kept going for years, grew it from a cutting someone gave her. And at the end nearest the steps she had a lavender that she used to bring inside in winter. Mrs. Polly paused. And a climbing hydrangea on the bank itself. She was very proud of that. It takes years to establish, and she'd had it from when they first came to the estate. Is it still there? I don't know, I haven't been down those steps in some years. Mrs. Polly turned back to the bread. The steps are slippery in winter. Clara put on her coat again and went back outside and picked her way down the icy steps to the lower terrace. She examined the bank carefully, section by section, pulling back dead stems and checking the base of things. Near the center of the bank she found it, the climbing hydrangea, old and thick-stemmed, its bark peeling in the way hydrangeas do when they are comfortable and established. It was alive. Its clinging rootlets were attached to the stone of the bank in dozens of places, and its stems had continued growing without any guidance for 11 years, sprawling in every direction. It would need significant work to bring it back into any kind of order, but it was alive, which was the only thing that mattered. Clara pressed her hand flat against the main stem. Under her palm she could feel the hardness of living wood. She thought of Lady Ashworth bringing tea down here on fine days. Looking out at the view, she considered the best thing about the estate, growing her herbs and her long-established rosemary and this climbing hydrangea that took years to settle. She had been a woman who took the long view, who planted things knowing she might not see their full expression for years, who built iron hooks into walls and put in climbing plants that would take a decade to cover them properly, who kept meticulous records of everything she tried and everything she observed so that whoever came after her would not have to guess. She had taken care always not just of the present, but of the future of the garden. And then she was gone before the future arrived. Clara straightened up from the bank. She was not given to sentiment in her professional thinking, or so she told herself, but standing on the hidden terrace in the winter cold with her hand on the living stem of a plant that had outlasted the person who planted it, she felt the full weight of what she had been given responsibility for, and it was not just the grounds and the accounts and the drainage. It was something more than that, something that could not be written in a budget or listed in an assessment report. She went back to work. The winter routine settled into its own rhythm. Clara worked in the glass house and the records room and the estate office, a small room off the front hall that she had claimed in the first week. She wrote orders and submitted accounts and planned the spring planting schedule in detail, cross-referencing constantly with Lady Ashworth's records and her own notes from conversations with George and Mrs. Polly. She wrote letters to nurseries and seed suppliers and occasionally to the local farming community, introducing herself, establishing relationships, because she had learned early that an estate manager who knows her neighbors has resources that no budget can buy. The response from the local community was, she found, warmer than she had expected. The North Estate was known in the area not always with fondness. The years of neglect had allowed some of its boundary fences to fall into disrepair, which had caused occasional problems with livestock from neighboring farms. The estate's reputation for distant, uncommunicative management had not made friends. But Clara came to these conversations in person, on foot where possible, and she listened before she spoke, and she was specific about what she intended to do and when. By the end of February she had an arrangement with the farm to the east to borrow machinery when needed, a source of good compost from a market gardener 3 miles away, and the goodwill of most of the people within walking distance of the estate gate. She told none of this to Lord Ashworth's office. It was not something that appeared in any budget line or required approval. It was simply the work. In March, the seedlings in the glass house outgrew their initial trays, and she spent an entire day potting them on. Patrick and his brother Oliver helped, the 3 of them working along the length of the glasshouse benches, lifting each seedling with care and settling it into its larger pot. Patrick was good with his hands in a way that surprised her. He handled the small seedlings with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his size, his broad hands finding the right pressure without being told. "You've done this before," Clara said. "My grandmother had a garden," he said. "When I was small I used to help her." She asked him nothing more about it, but she noted it. In the afternoons, when the light was right, she worked in the walled garden. She had begun the clearance there in December, working methodically from the gate inward, cutting back the worst of the overgrowth to expose the original structure of the beds. It was slow work, not because of the volume of growth, although that was considerable, but because she had to be careful. Every cut risked damaging something that was dormant but alive beneath. She made herself go slowly. She made herself look before she cut. Under the worst of the overgrowth near the south wall, she found something that made her stop. A bulb bed, a whole section of the south wall's base planting had been put in as bulbs, deeply planted, protected by the dense growth above them. They had been pushed too deep to flower for years. But when she carefully cleared the soil around them, she could see their tips beginning to emerge with the first hesitation of early spring, pale and slightly blind, searching upward through the dark. She knelt in the mud of the walled garden floor and counted them by feel. There were at least 60, maybe more. She went back to the 1986 ledger that evening and found them. Tulips and narcissi, south wall base bed, planted in October, mixed heritage varieties selected for scent rather than color. Lady Ashworth had written in the margin beside the entry, "The best beds are the ones that reward patience." Clara read that line twice. Then she put the ledger carefully back in its box and went to make herself a cup of tea, because it was late, and she had been in the records room for 2 hours, and the fire in the sitting room had gone out and the house was cold, and she needed warmth, and she needed to think about something other than work for a while. She did not always manage that last part. She thought about the spring planting schedule while she made tea. She thought about the walled garden while she drank it. She thought about the hidden terrace and the climbing hydrangea and the 60 or more bulbs pushing up through the south wall's base bed while she washed her cup and dried it and set it back on the shelf. She thought about Lady Ashworth's note in the margin, "The best beds are the ones that reward patience." She turned off the kitchen light and went up to bed, and in the darkness before she slept she made a list in her head of all the things that would be blooming in the walled garden by June. She made it slowly and with care, variety by variety, position by position, color and scent and timing. She made it the way Lady Ashworth had made her planting plans, with full attention, with genuine care, with the long view firmly in mind. When she finally slept, she slept deeply and well. Spring announced itself with a kind of violence that Clara had not anticipated from the north. In the south, spring arrived politely, a gradual warming, a slow greening, the kind of seasonal change that gave a person time to adjust. In the north it came in a rush, as though the land had been holding back through the months of cold and had only so much patience for waiting. 1 week the ground was still frozen at depth, the next everything moved at once. The grass deepened to green overnight. The trees along the drive burst into bud with a speed that seemed almost aggressive. And in the walled garden, the bulbs she had found blind and searching in the mud emerged into full color with barely a transition. She came out on a Monday morning to find a dozen narcissi open, and by Wednesday half the south wall bed was in flower. They were extraordinary. She had known from the ledger notes that Lady Ashworth had selected them for scent. She had expected them to be fragrant. She had not expected the walled garden on that first fully blooming morning to smell like an entirely different world, warmer, richer, layered with something that was partly the flowers and partly the stone itself, which had absorbed the warmth of the previous day and was releasing it with the dawn. She stood in the middle of the walled garden with her hands at her sides and breathed it in and felt, for a moment, something close to gratitude that she had been sent here and not somewhere else. She did not say that to anyone. She wrote it in her personal notebook in the evening with the precision she brought to everything else, noted the date, the temperature, the varieties blooming, the nature of the scent. Then she underlined the last line. She had not written anything personal in her estate notebooks before that entry. She did not explain to herself why she wrote it now. She simply closed the notebook and went on with the work. Patrick noticed the walled garden the following day. He had not been inside it before. She had done all the winter clearance herself and had kept it, not secretively but naturally, as her own space of progress. He came to the door in the morning with a question about the compost delivery and saw the flowers through the open door and stopped speaking mid-sentence. "You can go in," Clara said. He walked in slowly, looking at the walls, the beds, the climbing roses which had been cut back now and were showing the first tentative green of new growth in 100 places along their old wood. He stopped at the south wall bed and stood in the scent of the narcissi. "This is something," he said, which was the most he had ever said about anything non-practical. "It will be better in June," Clara said. He nodded. He went back out to arrange the compost. But she noticed that afternoon that he had trimmed the edges of the path leading to the walled garden door without being asked, and had done it neatly. The spring became a test of everything she had planned. The orders she had placed through winter arrived. The Hidcote lavender plants for the western walk, delivered in sturdy boxes and slightly travel-shocked but sound. The climbing roses for the gaps in the walled garden wall coverage. 2 heritage varieties sourced from the Yorkshire grower she had spent those long telephone evenings with. The herb plants for the lower terrace, including, after a considerable search and a lucky connection via a letter to a botanical garden, a rosemary grown from the same original stock as Lady Ashworth's. The botanical garden had received a cutting from the estate garden 20 years ago, had grown it on, and the head gardener there had been pleased to provide a return cutting when Clara explained its history. She had written that letter 4 times before she was satisfied with it. She did not usually revise letters, but that one mattered. Mrs. Polly was the one who collected the post each morning. On the day the botanical garden's letter arrived confirming they could provide the rosemary cutting, she brought it directly to Clara in the estate office rather than leaving it on the desk as usual. She set it down without speaking. Clara opened it, read it, and looked up. Mrs. Polly was still standing in the doorway. "She will have her rosemary back," Clara said. Mrs. Polly straightened her apron with both hands, the gesture she always made when she was keeping something composed that did not want to be composed. "I'll put the kettle on," she said. There was a morning in late April when Clara stood at the entrance to the walled garden and felt, for the first time since arriving, that the estate was beginning to answer her. It was not a dramatic thing. There was no single moment of transformation, no day when she could point to the grounds and say, "Here, this is where everything changed." It was instead a gradual accumulation, the lavender plants settling into their positions along the western walk, already standing straighter after 2 weeks in the ground, the climbing roses in the walled garden putting on new growth that was longer and more confident than the tentative first shoots of early spring, the narcissi finishing their season and leaving behind healthy, wide-leafed foliage that told her the bulbs below had stored enough energy for a strong display next year. She walked the grounds every morning. She had done this since the first week, but the walk was different now. In autumn and winter she had been reading the damage, measuring it, cataloging it, understanding it. Now she was reading recovery, and recovery was a different language entirely. It was quieter, slower. It revealed itself in details that required patience to see, the slight deepening of color in a leaf, the straightening of a stem that had been leaning, the first appearance of a flower bud on a plant that had not flowered in years. The walled garden was, she thought, the place where this language was most clearly spoken. She spent an hour in there each morning, before the day's work properly began. She walked the paths, checked the climbers, monitored the bulb foliage, looked at the newly planted herbs along the south wall base. She had excavated the raised bed along the south wall that the 1903 plan had shown, clearing it carefully and building it up with compost and good topsoil. She had planted into it the heat-loving herbs that Lady Ashworth's records showed she had grown there, thyme in several varieties, oregano, a tender lavender that needed the wall's warmth to survive the winters. She had mulched everything deeply. On this particular April morning, while she was checking the state of the soil in the raised bed, she heard the gate from the kitchen garden creak and looked up to find George coming in. He had not come into the walled garden since the first day he had stood at its door. She had not asked him to. She had understood that it was a place that carried something heavy for him, as it had for his wife, and that the heaviness needed its own time. He stood just inside the gate and looked around with the expression of a man who is preparing himself to feel something and is not entirely sure he is ready. Clara did not say anything. She turned back to the raised bed and resumed checking the soil moisture level near the thyme plants. She gave him the space of silence that she knew he needed. After a while she heard him take a few steps along the gravel path, then a few more. She heard him stop at the south wall. "The roses have taken," he said. "They're doing well," she agreed. She did not look up. "The middle section was always the strongest," he said, "on the south wall. She used to say the mortar in the middle of that wall had the most iron in it, and that's why the color was always deeper there." Clara made a note of that, the iron content of the mortar affecting soil chemistry near the wall base. It was exactly the kind of detail that would never appear in a general gardening manual and would only be known by someone who had paid attention for years. "I'll look at the middle section particularly," she said. George was quiet for a moment. She heard him sit down on the bench along the north wall, the one that was opposite the south-facing warmth, angled to catch it. "She used to sit there," he said, "on that bench, in the evening when the wall had held the heat of the day. She said it was the warmest seat on the whole estate." Clara looked at the bench. It was solid stone, clean now. She had scrubbed it in February. She looked at the way it was positioned, the angle at which it caught the reflected warmth of the south wall. "It probably is," she said. George sat there for about 20 minutes. Clara worked nearby. They did not talk for most of that time. It was not the silence of two people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people who are sharing a space comfortably, which is a different thing entirely. When he got up to leave, he said, without making it particularly significant, "The sweet peas want to go in along the east wall by the end of the month. She always said the 1st of May was too late." Clara wrote it down. May arrived with a confidence that the garden seemed to recognize. The lavender along the western walk was in full growth now, filling out from the travel shock sticks that had arrived in their cardboard boxes. The climbing hydrangea on the hidden terrace bank had responded to the careful pruning she had given it in early spring by throwing out a cascade of new growth, long, reaching stems that she tied into place along the bank. The wisteria over the main gate had come into bud, the same wisteria George had described, the one that had made Lady Ashworth bring everyone out to look at it. Clara did not know that it was the same wisteria. She simply watched its buds with interest, noting their progress in her notebook. The day it opened, she understood why Lady Ashworth had called everyone out. She was walking back from checking the lower terrace in the early morning when she came around the curve of the drive and saw the gate, and the wisteria over it was fully open, hundreds of long purple flower clusters hanging from the gate arch, their color extraordinary in the morning light, their scent arriving before she was even close enough to see the individual flowers clearly. She stopped walking. She stood there for a moment with her notebook in her hand and simply looked. Then she went to the kitchen and said, "Mrs. Polly, George, come outside." Mrs. Polly came with her apron on. George came from the direction of the compost area with his gloves still in his hand. They all three stood in front of the gate and looked up at the wisteria. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Mrs. Polly made a sound that was very small and pressed her lips together firmly. George put his gloves in his coat pocket. He cleared his throat. "I'll prune it properly in July," he said, which was entirely practical and addressed nothing, and was exactly the right thing to say. Clara nodded. She wrote in her notebook, "Wisteria in bloom, gate arch, early May, full expression, scent notable." She wrote it steadily and clearly. Then she put the notebook away and said good morning to the gate and the wisteria and walked back to the estate office to start the day's accounts. The accounts were, by this point, a source of some satisfaction. She had managed the estate budget carefully through winter, spending on essentials and delaying anything that could wait, and she had come through the worst season with money still available for the spring planting. She had also, with some care and some very particular letter writing, secured a small grant from a regional heritage trust for the restoration of the walled garden specifically, on the grounds that the garden was part of the estate's historic record and that the original planting plans dated from 1903. The grant was not large, but it covered the cost of the heritage rose varieties she had ordered from Yorkshire and the specialist lime render repair to the walled garden walls and the hand-wrought iron replacement hooks that she had commissioned from a metalworker in the nearby town to match the originals. That last item had not been strictly necessary. She could have used modern hooks that would have served the same function at a fraction of the cost. She had chosen the matching ones anyway, for reasons that she would have described as professional if anyone had asked. She submitted the accounts to Lord Ashworth's office at the end of each month, as instructed. She heard back from Mr. Lane, his secretary, periodically, brief acknowledgements, occasional approval of additional budget items. Lord Ashworth himself had not responded to any correspondence she had sent. She did not adjust her approach on the basis of this. She wrote every report as though it would be read carefully, because she believed a report should be written that way regardless of who read it or how thoroughly. In June, the walled garden reached the state she had first imagined it could reach on the day she had found the old 1903 plan tucked between the record's room ledger pages. The south wall roses were in bloom, great open-petaled things in deep rose pink, their scent filling the walled space with something that was genuinely difficult to walk away from. The herb bed in the raised section was in full summer growth, the thyme spilling over the stone edging of the bed, the oregano already tall and beginning to flower. The sweet peas were climbing their strings along the east wall in colors that ranged from white to deep violet, exactly as George's memory had described. The bulbs along the south wall base bed were over, their foliage still healthy and green. She had left it deliberately, Even though some people would have preferred a tidier look, the foliage needed to remain until it died back naturally so the bulbs could gather energy for next year. She had tied a small label to the edge of the bed that said, "Foliage, do not cut until yellow." She had done this in case Patrick was ever working in the walled garden without her. She had used Mrs. Polly's good handwriting ink, the kind she kept for correspondence. It seemed appropriate. On a June evening when the roses were at their peak, Clara brought her supper into the walled garden and sat on the stone bench on the north wall, Lady Ashworth's bench, the warmest seat on the estate, and ate it in the long northern evening light with the scent of the roses and the sweet peas around her, and the sound of the fountain, which George had finally managed to repair in May after 3 weeks of careful work on the pipe system. The water sound in the walled garden was, as Mrs. Polly had said it used to be, exactly right. She ate her supper, she watched the light change on the south wall. She thought about the season ahead and what the late summer would bring, and the autumn planting she was already planning, and whether the raised bed herbs would need additional protection through the coming winter. She did not think about the people who had called the North Estate a punishment. She had stopped thinking about that sometime in February, without deciding to, without ceremony. It had simply become irrelevant to the life she was actually living. An evening moth found its way through the walled garden gate as the light fell, and circled the rose clusters on the south wall in a slow, unhurried way, and Clara watched it with the same patient attention she brought to everything here. The fountain played in the background, the roses held their last warmth. The letter that changed the direction of the summer arrived in July, addressed to Miss Webb, estate manager, the North Estate. It came from a woman named Harriet Vane, who introduced herself as the secretary of the Northern Agricultural and Heritage Society, which had been, until that point, a name entirely unknown to Clara. The letter explained that the society organized an annual garden visit program for its members, a series of open afternoons at estates and gardens of historical or horticultural interest throughout the northern region. Miss Vane wrote that she had heard, through what she described as quite enthusiastic reports from several local acquaintances, that the gardens of the North Estate were undergoing a significant restoration of some interest. She wondered whether Miss Webb might consider opening the gardens to a society visit in late summer. Clara read the letter twice. Then she took it to Mrs. Polly, who was in the kitchen, because there was context here that she did not fully have. "The Northern Agricultural and Heritage Society," she said. Mrs. Polly looked at the letter. Her expression shifted through several things very quickly. "They are a serious organization," she said. "Lady Ashworth was a member. She had them here twice, once in 1984 and once in 1989. The 1989 visit was the year the walled garden was at its best. She always said so. She had over 40 people in the garden." Clara looked back at the letter. "And Lord Ashworth," she said carefully, "would he have an opinion on whether the estate should receive visitors?" Mrs. Polly was quiet for a moment. "He would have had an opinion once," she said. "I could not say what it is now, but Lady Ashworth would have written back the same day, I can tell you that." Clara considered this for the length of time it took her to walk to the estate office and sit down at the desk. Then she picked up her pen. She wrote to Mr. Lane at Lord Ashworth's London address, informing him that the Northern Agricultural and Heritage Society had requested a garden visit and asking for guidance on whether Lord Ashworth wished to be consulted before she confirmed or declined. She sent the letter. Then she wrote to Miss Vane at the Society and said that she expected to be able to confirm within the fortnight and hoped that was sufficient time. Mr. Lane's reply arrived in 4 days. It said, "Lord Ashworth sees no objection. At your discretion, Miss Webb." She wrote back to Miss Vane the same afternoon. The preparation for the garden visit had an unexpected effect on the estate. It was not that the work increased significantly. The restoration had been progressing steadily, and there was no need to rush anything for the sake of appearance. What changed was subtler than that. There was a sense of purpose with a visible point on the horizon, a moment that would arrive and require the work to be seen. Clara noticed it in herself and in George and in Patrick, who had by now become a permanent fixture of the estate work rather than a hired addition. George repainted the gate. He did it on his own initiative without Clara mentioning it, came back from town one afternoon with a tin of the right black paint and spent the better part of 2 days working on the iron, and when he was done the gate looked entirely different. Not new but honored, like something that had been given back its proper dignity. Patrick relayed the gravel on the main drive, pulling up the worst of the established weeds by hand and replacing the lost depth of gravel with new material from the local supplier. He did the edges particularly carefully because he had noticed that Clara always looked at edges. How a path was kept at its margins told you, she had said once, more about the care of a garden than almost anything else. Mrs. Polly cleaned the house from top to bottom, more thoroughly than she had since Clara's arrival, working through each room systematically. She opened rooms that had been closed since Lady Ashworth's death and let the summer air through the windows, and she found in the process a set of watercolor paintings rolled in a cardboard tube in a cupboard in the small study, paintings of the walled garden done by hand, dated in the late 1980s. She brought them to Clara without comment. Clara unrolled them carefully on the estate office desk. They were good paintings. Competent and careful, done by someone who was looking at the garden with genuine affection rather than any professional detachment. She recognized what she was looking at immediately: the south wall, the east wall with its sweet peas, the central path, the stone bench. The walled garden in its fullness, preserved in watercolor by someone who had loved it and had wanted perhaps to keep some version of it that wouldn't change with the seasons. She looked at the corner of each painting for a signature or a date. There was no signature, only the dates: July 1988, August 1988, September 1988. She looked at the paintings for a long time. Then she took them to Mrs. Polly and asked who had painted them. Mrs. Polly looked at them. She was quiet for longer than usual. Lord Ashworth, she said. He used to paint before. Clara looked at the paintings again, the care in them, the particular attention to the south wall and the bench, the way the light was caught in the climbing roses. He painted the garden, she said. He painted everything Lady Ashworth loved, Mrs. Polly said quietly. He stopped when she died. I didn't know these were still here. I thought he'd taken them when he left. Clara rolled the paintings gently and put them back in their tube. She set the tube on the corner of her desk where it would not be forgotten. She would mention them to Mr. Lane in her next letter. She would ask whether Lord Ashworth wished them sent to London or kept at the estate. She would ask carefully, because the answer, whatever it was, would tell her something about the man she had been working for at a distance all these months. The man who had sent 3 words through his secretary, "At your discretion, Miss Webb." The man who had not been to his own estate in 11 years. The man who had once sat in the walled garden in August and September and painted the roses and the bench and the light on the south wall. She put away her pen and went back out to the garden, because the day was clear and there was work to do before the light went, and the garden visit was now 6 weeks away, and the east wall sweet peas needed new strings in 3 places. She worked until the light failed. Then she walked back through the garden in the blue northern dusk, through the walled garden gate, past the south wall roses whose scent was always strongest in the evening, and she paused for a moment at the stone bench. She did not sit on it. She had not sat on it since the first time she had entered the garden. But she stood beside it and looked at the south wall the way the paintings had shown it, the light, the roses, the warmth in the stone. Then she went inside. The Northern Agricultural and Heritage Society arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late August, 38 people, which was more than Clara had expected, traveling in 2 coaches that pulled up at the gate with a sound that Mrs. Polly said she had not heard since 1989, and which made George appear from the direction of the kitchen garden and stand very still for a moment, as though recalibrating. Clara met them at the gate herself. She had considered what to wear with some care, which was not something she usually spent time on, and had settled on her good dark coat over her usual working clothes, practical but not unprofessional. She shook hands with Miss Vane, who turned out to be a brisk, intelligent woman in her mid-50s, who had clearly done her research about the estate, and was already looking at the newly painted gate and the re-gravelled drive with the experienced eye of someone who visited many gardens and knew exactly what she was seeing. "The avenue planting," Miss Vane said, looking at the trees along the drive, "are those original?" "The trees are," Clara said. "They were planted in the 1880s according to the estate records. I've had some significant deadwood removed this year and the lower branches cleared, but the structure is as it was." Miss Vane nodded with an expression of professional approval. She turned to her group, who were filing through the gate in an orderly way, murmuring to each other in the manner of people who go to gardens regularly and have opinions about things. They were a varied group, some obviously agricultural, others more horticultural, a few who seemed primarily interested in the history of the estate rather than the plants. Several had notebooks. One had a large camera. Clara led them along the drive to the house and then directly to the formal garden, which she had planned as the beginning of the route. The formal garden was the most visibly changed section of the estate, the place where the difference between its condition a year ago and its condition now was most immediately apparent. The border structure was clear and planted, the paths were clean, the lavender along the western walk was a full and fragrant hedge of silvery green. The roses in the front beds were finished for the season, but the hips were rich and red, and the foliage was healthy and correct. She did not say what it had looked like when she arrived. She did not need to. Several people in the group had clearly heard something about the estate's history, because they exchanged glances and made notes with the particular concentration of people who are adding new information to an existing picture. Miss Vane stayed at Clara's side through the formal garden, asking questions that were genuinely knowledgeable. She knew her plant names, she understood drainage. She asked specifically about the soil amendments Clara had made to the borders and listened to the answers properly. The group moved with her through the gate in the yew hedge. The yew hedge itself was a subject of some conversation, because it was original, almost a century old, and while it had been neglected, it was now showing good recovery growth after the pruning she had given it in early spring. Beyond the yew hedge, the path curved toward the walled garden entrance. Clara unlocked the walled garden door and pushed it open and stepped back to let the group in. She watched their faces. She had spent enough time in the walled garden to have lost the capacity to see it as a visitor would. She knew every plant in it, every section of wall, every point where the climbing roses were stronger or weaker, every detail of the raised herb bed and the sweet pea strings. But she still understood intellectually what it must look like to someone walking through that gate for the first time, the enclosure, the warmth, the particular intensity that a walled garden has of the outside world simply not existing anymore, and the scent, and then the visual layering of climbers and borders and central path and the fountain. The fountain was playing. She had timed her request to George carefully. The group entered and spread out in the way that people do in a beautiful enclosed space, seeking different corners, moving toward the things that caught their attention. The woman with the camera stopped just inside the door and stood looking at the south wall for a long time before taking any photographs. A man in his 60s went directly to the climbing roses and began examining the training and the new growth with the intense attention of someone who grew roses himself. Miss Vane went to the stone bench on the north wall and stood beside it and looked at the whole garden from that position, and then looked at Clara. "How long has the restoration taken?" she asked. "Almost a year," Clara said. "The clearance work began in November, the replanting in spring. The roses are heritage varieties. Most of them, 2 of them, are the same varieties that were here originally. I sourced them from a specialist grower in Yorkshire. The others are varieties that Lady Ashworth grew elsewhere on the estate, and that I thought were consistent with the character of the garden." Miss Vane looked at the sweet peas along the east wall, and those. An annual planting. The originals were here until 11 years ago. Lady Ashworth planted them from seed each spring along strings tied to the wall. I have done the same this year. Miss Vane wrote something in her notebook. "You have Lady Ashworth's records?" she asked. "I do. Her planting records from 1973 to 1993 are complete and have been enormously useful. The estate was fortunate that they were preserved." "Was that your doing?" Clara considered the question. "That was Mrs. Polly's doing," she said, "the housekeeper. She kept them through the years when no one else was keeping anything." Miss Vane looked at her steadily. "I would like to include the North Estate in next year's full program if you would be willing," she said. "The restoration of this garden is genuinely significant work, Miss Webb. The scale of it, the historical accuracy, the quality of the execution." She paused. "We don't see this very often." Clara thanked her without making too much of it. The afternoon continued. The group spent over 2 hours at the estate, moving through all the sections she had prepared: the kitchen garden, the hidden lower terrace, the glass house with its new pane and the late seedling trays still in production. Mrs. Polly served tea on the front terrace of the house, which was the first time the front terrace had been used for anything in many years. Patrick had brushed the stone flags and set out the old estate chairs that lived in the outbuilding and had been cleaned and treated with oil that morning. It looked, Clara thought, like a house with people in it, like a place that was being lived in properly. The man who grew roses himself, she learned his name was Harold Brent, a retired farmer from the valley below who had been a society member for 30 years, found his way back to her while tea was being served. He had been in the walled garden twice during the afternoon, which she had noticed. "The south wall roses," he said, "the pink one with the flat, open flower and the strong scent." "I don't recognize it." "Old blush," she said. "It's a very old China rose, sometimes listed as one of the original China roses brought to Britain in the 18th century. Lady Ashworth had it from a cutting from a garden in Devon. She noted in her records that it had been growing in that garden for at least 50 years before she received it. The cutting I planted this year came from Yorkshire, from a grower who has maintained the same line." Harold Brent looked at her with the expression of a man who has just learned something genuinely interesting. "You know, I have been coming to garden visits for 30 years, he said. "And I cannot remember the last time a manager could tell me the history of a specific rose, cutting with that level of detail." Clara said Lady Ashworth kept very good records. "You read very good records, Miss Webb," he said. "That's a different skill." She accepted that without comment, but she remembered it. The coaches left in the early evening. Clara walked back to the house with Miss Vane, who was the last to go, and they stood for a moment at the gate, the newly painted gate, the wisteria over it finished now but its deep green foliage still fine. "I will be writing a piece about the estate for our newsletter," Miss Vane said. "If you have no objection, purely about the horticultural restoration, nothing personal." "I have no objection," Clara said. "And I will be mentioning it to the editor of the County Heritage Journal as well. They have an interest in garden restorations of this kind." She paused. "You should know that the word will travel from here. The garden is at a level that people will want to see. I would recommend you prepare for that." Clara thanked her and watched the second coach pull away down the lane. Then she turned back to the house, where Mrs. Polly and George were clearing away the tea things from the front terrace. She went to help. "Well," George said. He said it to the stack of chairs he was folding, not to Clara, which was his usual way. "Well," Clara said, "I think they liked the garden." George picked up 2 chairs and walked toward the outbuilding with them. "They liked it," he said over his shoulder. "You could see it in how they moved. People who like a garden slow down, they don't rush." Clara looked at the front terrace, now cleared, the stone flags bare again. She thought of Lady Ashworth, who had apparently said the lower terrace had the best view. She thought of the 1989 visit that Mrs. Polly had mentioned, 40 people in the walled garden, the roses at their best. "Mrs. Polly," she said, "was Lord Ashworth here for the 1989 visit?" Mrs. Polly gathered the last of the cups. "He was," she said. "He stood in the garden most of the afternoon. He was very proud, you could see it, even though he didn't say much. He never did say much even then, but he was proud." She went inside with the cups. George followed with the last of the chairs. Clara stood on the front terrace alone for a moment. She thought about the letter she would write tonight to Mr. Lane. She had to submit her late summer accounts and provide a seasonal report. She would mention the society visit, factually, without embellishment. She would mention that Miss Vane had spoken of including the estate in next year's full program. She would mention the newsletter piece. She would mention the paintings. She had been carrying that question for weeks and it needed to be asked. She went inside. Mrs. Polly had already put the kettle on. Clara sat down at the kitchen table and opened her notebook and began writing the letter in draft, the way she always worked, draft first, then copy clean in the morning when the words had settled. She wrote about the visit, she wrote about the accounts, she wrote about the planting schedule for autumn. Then she wrote, during the preparations for the visit, Mrs. Polly discovered in the small study a set of watercolor paintings of the walled garden, dated 1988. They appear to have been overlooked when the house was left. Please advise whether Lord Ashworth would like them returned to London or whether they should be kept at the estate. She stopped writing, she looked at what she had put down. Then she added, because it was relevant and because she believed in being precise, the paintings are well executed and show the garden at a moment when it was clearly in very fine condition. They have been kept safely and are undamaged. She would copy that clean in the morning. She would send it with the accounts. Mr. Lane would forward it to Lord Ashworth, or he would deal with it himself, or, as had happened more than once, the question would remain unanswered for several weeks before a brief response arrived. She did not know which of those it would be this time. She had learned not to predict. What she did know was that she had told the truth about the paintings, that they were well executed, that they showed the garden at a fine moment, that they were safe. Everything else was beyond her to control, and she had made her peace with that a long time ago, not with resignation, but with the practical clarity of someone who knows exactly which part of a problem is hers to solve, and concentrates her energy there without waste. She closed the notebook and went to bed and slept well and was up with the light, because in the garden the morning was always the best time, and there was still a great deal of work left to do. The response to her letter about the paintings came not from Mr. Lane but from Lord Ashworth himself. She had been at the estate for nearly a year by the time this happened. She had learned through a dozen small transactions the texture of his communication through his secretary, brief, administrative, precise, and written in a style that told her very little about the person behind it. Mr. Lane was efficient, he was not revealing. Lord Ashworth's own handwriting was different. She could see that from the envelope alone before she opened it, the address written by hand rather than typed, with a firm, angular script that pressed the pen quite hard into the paper. She opened it at the estate office desk on a grey September morning with her second cup of tea cooling beside her. It was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that he had received her letter and the seasonal report, and that the accounts were satisfactory, and that the news of the society visit was pleasing. He used the word pleasing without elaboration. The second paragraph said, "Please keep the paintings at the estate, they belong there." That was all, no closing remarks beyond his signature, which was abbreviated and not particularly legible. Clara read the letter twice. Then she put it in the correspondence file in the section she had labeled Lord Ashworth Direct. It was the first letter in that section. The file before it, labeled Lord Ashworth via Mr. Lane, was thick with responses. She finished her tea. She went to the small study where the tube of paintings had been placed on the shelf beside the window, the one with the best north light. She took the tube down and unrolled the paintings again on the desk and looked at them in the morning light. They belonged here, he had said so. It was a plain statement with an ordinary meaning, and she took it as such. But she also noted that he had not asked for them to be sent back, which he might have done if they represented something he preferred not to have nearby. He had chosen, deliberately, for them to stay. She found a frame in the outbuilding that afternoon, 2 of them, actually old frames that had once held something else, stored at the back behind the unused machinery. They were solid dark wood, not particularly decorative but the right scale. She cleaned them and brought them to the estate office. She spent part of the evening mounting 2 of the paintings, the one showing the south wall in full summer bloom and the one showing the east wall with the sweet peas, and hung them on the wall of the estate office where she would see them each day. The third painting, the one showing the stone bench with the full garden behind it, she kept rolled in the tube on the office shelf. She did not mount it yet. She was not sure where it should go. Mrs. Polly came into the office the next morning, saw the paintings on the wall, and stopped. She stood looking at them for long enough that Clara looked up from the accounts she was working on. Mrs. Polly's face was doing the thing it did when she was keeping something steady that did not want to be kept steady. She pressed her lips together in the familiar way, and then she said, "That's the south wall in July, and the east wall in August." "Yes," Clara said. "He painted them the summer after they were married," Mrs. Polly said. "He was 27. Lady Ashworth was 24. She laughed at him for painting the garden instead of the view because she said the view was better. He said the garden was hers and worth painting." Clara looked at the south wall painting. The roses in it were full and generous, captured by someone who was looking at them the way a person looks at something they love. "He was 27, she said. "Yes." Clara turned back to the accounts. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me that." Mrs. Polly went to make the morning tea, which was what she did when she had said something that mattered and needed a practical reason to leave the room. Clara sat at the desk and looked at the accounts figures on the page in front of her. She did not look at the paintings, but she knew they were there. She finished the morning accounts and went out to the garden, because the day was clear and the autumn planting list was long and the soil was in good condition, and there were a great many things still to do before the cold came again. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon without stopping. Patrick was in the kitchen garden. George was checking the boundary fences on the eastern side. The estate was occupied with itself, busy in the particular way of autumn when everything is completing or preparing, the end of one cycle pressing up against the beginning of the next. By the time she came in for the evening, she was tired in the way that was satisfying rather than draining, the tiredness of having done real work in good conditions and made visible progress. She cleaned up and sat at the estate office desk to write the list for the following day. The south wall painting caught the last of the evening light. The roses in it glowed slightly. She would need to mention in her next monthly report that the autumn bulb order had been placed, that the boundary fence repair on the east side was underway, that the lower terrace had been prepared for its winter planting of hardy herbs. And she would need to begin thinking, for the first time seriously, about what the estate would look like next spring. Not just what plants would be where, but the overall impression, because Miss Vane had said that the word would travel, and she believed her, and that meant the estate needed to be ready to be seen. She wrote the list for the following day. She reviewed the spring planting plan. She looked at the budget and did the arithmetic she had done many times already, and confirmed that what she wanted to do was what the budget would allow with careful management. Then she wrote one more note to herself at the bottom of the page, in the smaller handwriting she used for personal things. Find out when Lord Ashworth is likely to visit. She looked at the note for a moment, then she underlined it. She had been at the North Estate for almost a year, and Lord Ashworth had not once come to see it. She did not know what was right about raising that question, or how to raise it, or whether it was her place to raise it at all. But she was beginning to believe that it was important, not for herself and not for the garden's sake. The garden would be what it was regardless of who saw it. It was important for him, for the reason the paintings were still in the tube. For the reason a letter about them had come not from the secretary, but in angular handwriting pressed hard into the paper. He needed to come back. She was not sure yet how to say that in a letter to his secretary, but she would find the words. She always found the words eventually. She did not write directly to Lord Ashworth. She wrote to Mr. Lane because that was the established channel, and she was not a person who changed established channels without a reason that was clearly professional in nature. The letter was part of her quarterly report, which she submitted at the end of September as the second year of her tenure was beginning. The report was thorough and specific, covering the condition of every section of the grounds, the accounts to date, the autumn planting schedule, and the projected requirements for the coming year. At the end of it, in a section she labeled Estate Visit Schedule, she wrote that the Society had expressed interest in including the estate in their full program for the following summer. She noted that this would likely increase interest in the estate from other visiting parties and heritage organizations. She noted that it might also be an appropriate time for the estate owner to review the grounds in person, if he wished to do so before the property became more widely known. That last sentence had taken her 4 attempts to write in a way that was sufficiently neutral. She was satisfied with the version she sent. It said what needed to be said without overstepping. Mr. Lane's reply to the quarterly report was the usual kind, brief, administrative, confirming receipt and approval of the budget projection. The last line read, "Lord Ashworth has noted your suggestion regarding a personal visit and will consider it." Clara filed the reply. She said nothing about it to George or Mrs. Polly, because she had no confirmation that a visit would happen, and she saw no reason to raise an expectation that might come to nothing. October arrived, and with it, the full autumn transformation of the estate that Clara was experiencing for the first time. Her first autumn here had been in the ground's neglected state. She had been too deep in assessment and repair to observe the season itself. This autumn was different. This autumn the estate had shape, and that shape changed with the season in a way she could actually see. The lavender along the western walk, finished flowering, had settled into its characteristic silver gray that suited the October light better than the summer purple. The kitchen garden was in the productive stage that made George genuinely animated. He had expanded the vegetable beds in spring with Clara's blessing, and they were now producing more than the household could use, the surplus going to Patrick's family and to the farmer to the east who had lent machinery through the summer. The walled garden in autumn was a revelation. She had not known what to expect, had known from the records which plants would still be performing and which would be finishing, but the reality of being in the space in autumn was different from knowing it on paper. The climbing hydrangea on the lower terrace bank was in its autumn color, the leaves deepening before they fell. The roses on the walled garden walls had finished their second flush and were setting hips, not the large decorative hips of some modern varieties but the small, numerous, intense red hips of the heritage roses, clustered thickly along the old wood. The sweet peas were done. She had let them seed at the end, collecting the dry pods for next year. The strings on the east wall stood empty. She planted tulip bulbs in the south wall base bed in the first week of October, a different set from the narcissi already there, chosen from Lady Ashworth's records for the colors she had preferred in that bed, and planted at the timing she had specified. Deep planting, as Lady Ashworth always did. She pressed each bulb into the soil herself, because this felt like something that should be done by hand rather than delegated. Mrs. Polly came to the walled garden door on the second afternoon of this planting and stood watching for a while. Clara could hear her but kept working. She always planted those herself, Mrs. Polly said it was the one thing that was too important to hand to someone else. I agree with her, Clara said. She heard Mrs. Polly smile in the particular way she had, not a laugh, just a slight softening in her breath. There is a letter, Mrs. Polly said. It came this morning. I left it on your desk. The handwriting, it is the same as the painting letter. Clara pressed the last bulb down into the soil and smoothed the earth over it and straightened up. Thank you, she said. She went to the estate office. The envelope was where Mrs. Polly had left it, at the center of the desk, the angular handwriting clear in the afternoon light. She opened it. The letter was 3 paragraphs this time. The first paragraph acknowledged the quarterly report and the budget projections. The second said, I intend to visit the estate in the first week of April, if that is convenient for you and for the grounds. Please advise of any preparations required on my behalf. The third paragraph was brief. I am told the wisteria was particularly fine this year. Clara read all 3 paragraphs twice, then she sat down. The first week of April, 6 months away. The grounds would be at a particular stage in 6 months, the bulbs coming up, the roses in their early growth, the lavender showing its first new silver. The walled garden would have its first flowers of the season. The wisteria, if the winter was mild enough, would be in early bud. Not full summer, not the height of everything, but something genuine and growing and alive, which was, she thought, better than the performance of full summer. A garden in April was a garden with all its promise still ahead of it. It was the garden at its most honest. She wrote back the same afternoon. She did not send it through Mr. Lane. She addressed it directly in reply to what had been written directly. She confirmed the first week of April. She noted which rooms in the house would be prepared. She gave a brief account of where the grounds would be in that season and what he would find. She suggested he might wish to spend some time in the walled garden, which in April would have the first bulb display coming to its peak. In the last paragraph she wrote, I am glad to hear the wisteria was reported well. It is in good health, and I expect it will be at least as good next year. Lady Ashworth's planting notes include a reference to it in 1989. I have been following her maintenance schedule. She sent it, then she went to find Mrs. Polly and George. She found them both in the kitchen, which was where important conversations usually happened on the estate, not by design, but because the kitchen was the warmest room in the house and the most human. Lord Ashworth will visit in April, she said. Mrs. Polly put down the knife she was holding. George, who was seated at the table with a cup of tea, went very still. Neither of them said anything for a moment. April, Mrs. Polly said finally. The first week, Clara confirmed. I will need to know from both of you what preparations the house will need. I can manage the grounds and the accounts, but the house is your area, and I want to do this properly. Mrs. Polly sat down at the table, which was something she rarely did in the kitchen while there was work to be done. She sat down and folded her hands on the table and looked at them. 11 years, she said. It was not an accusation, it was not self-pity, it was simply the fact stated in full. I know, Clara said. He will find it different from how he left it. Very, Clara said. George looked at the table. He cleared his throat once and then was quiet. Good different, Mrs. Polly said. She looked up. I want to be clear about that. I mean good different. I understood that, Clara said. I will need to open the East Wing rooms, Mrs. Polly said, becoming practical the way she always did when things became important. They haven't been aired in years. I'll need at least 3 weeks to do that properly, probably 4. The chimneys in 2 of those rooms will need checking before we light fires. I'll get someone from the village, Clara said. And the silver, Mrs. Polly said. We have silver in the dining room cupboard that I have been cleaning once a year because I refuse to let it go dull. I'll do it again in March. Thank you, Clara said. George stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the garden, which was October bare and beautiful in the low afternoon light. He stood there for a long moment. The lower terrace steps, he said. I've been meaning to reset 3 of the stones. They've shifted. If he's going down to that terrace, I want them solid. By March, Clara said, there's time. He nodded without turning from the window. There's time, he agreed. Then he said to the garden, not to either of them, he should have come back sooner, but there's no use in that, he'll be here in April. Clara did not agree or disagree with the first part. The second part was what mattered. Yes, she said, he will be. She spent the rest of October and all of November working through the estate with the April visit in the back of her mind, not as a performance to plan toward, but as a point on the calendar that made the work more specific. She found herself looking at the grounds with a slight additional attention to certain things. The approach from the gate, which needed to be as good as it could be by then. The general impression of the formal garden in April, which would depend on how the roses were coming through their winter and how early the bulbs decided to open. She walked every morning as she always had. She wrote her lists. She ordered what was needed. She answered correspondence from the Heritage Society and from Miss Vane, who had indeed sent a piece about the estate to the county journal and who sent Clara a copy of the published version with a note that said, I thought you would want to see this. They are very interested in the estate's history. The piece was well written. It described the walled garden with precision and warmth. It mentioned the 1903 planting plan. It mentioned the heritage rose varieties. It mentioned the restored fountain and the recovered sweet pea tradition. It did not mention Lady Ashworth by name, which Clara thought was the right choice. It did not need to. Anyone who knew the estate would know who had built the garden. Anyone who did not know the estate would know from the piece that the garden had been built by someone who had loved it deeply. It was, Clara thought, a truthful account. She pinned it to the board in the estate office beside the paintings. Then she went out to check on the autumn bulb planting in the main borders, because the October soil was perfect and there was work to do before the cold set hard, and April was 6 months away, and every month between now and then was a month in which the garden was getting ready for something. She did not use the word ready to anyone, she kept that to herself, but it was the right word. The garden was getting ready. Everything in it was building toward the spring with the particular determination of living things that do not know they are waiting for anything specific and simply grow regardless. The way living things do when they are tended properly and given what they need and trusted to find their own way to the light. November brought the quiet that Clara had come to consider the estate's true default state, not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of a place that was deeply itself and had no need to demonstrate that to anyone. She had visitors from the village occasionally. Harold Brent, who grew roses, came twice more after the society visit, once to see the walled garden in September and once simply, it seemed, because he had been passing and felt like talking to someone who knew what they were discussing. He was an uncomplicated man with a clear and honest interest in horticulture, and Clara found his visits restoring in the way that all direct, specific conversation about practical things was restoring when the weeks were otherwise solitary. He told her on his second visit that he had heard about the county journal piece from 3 separate people before he had read it himself, and that each of those 3 people had mentioned the North Estate with the specific quality of interest reserved for a place that had recently become worth knowing. You should be prepared for more attention, he said. Horticultural circles are not large and the piece was well circulated. Miss Vane said the same thing, Clara said. Miss Vane is usually right about these things. She appreciated the directness of that. She noted what it meant for the spring and added to her mental list the practical requirements of becoming a known garden rather than an unknown one, better signage at the gate, a clear visitor path, a written guide to the planting for those who wanted one. These were not things she had needed before, they were things she would need soon. December came with its particular gifts of frost and clarity and long quiet evenings. Mrs. Polly began her preparation of the east wing in the second week. She approached it methodically, 1 room each day, working through the dust and the stillness of rooms that had been closed against loss for 11 years. Clara helped on weekends when the outdoor work was minimal, carrying things, shifting furniture where Mrs. Polly needed help, opening the windows of each room when the outdoor temperature was above freezing to let fresh air move through. The east wing was well furnished. Lady Ashworth had had taste and a clear sense of what a room should feel like, and even after 11 years of closure the rooms had a quality that was evident beneath the dust. On the morning they opened the last of the east wing rooms, a small sitting room at the corner of the wing, with windows on two sides and a view of both the formal garden and the walled garden wall. Mrs. Polly stood for a moment and looked at the view and said nothing. Clara looked at it too. The winter garden, the walled garden wall with its old stone holding the grey light, the bare trees of the avenue in the distance. It was a remarkable view. He used to work in this room, Mrs. Polly said. He liked having the view on two sides. He said it kept him from spending too much time at his desk. Clara looked at the desk in the corner, small and solid, positioned precisely to catch both views. "I'll make sure it's properly prepared," she said. Mrs. Polly smoothed the curtain beside the window. "Thank you," she said. "I'll have it as it was." They worked in the east wing for the rest of that day, and by evening it was beginning to look like rooms rather than storage. There was still work to do. The chimney in the main bedroom had not yet been inspected, and the curtains in two rooms needed cleaning before they could be properly hung. But the shape of the thing was clear. By April it would be right. In January, Clara wrote the annual estate report, a full document rather than the monthly summaries, covering the complete first year of her tenure. She was precise and thorough as always, setting out what had been done and what remained to do, what had been spent and what would be needed, the condition of every section of the estate and the plan for the year ahead. She also, at the end of the document, included a summary of the restoration work on the walled garden specifically, its history, the discovery of the 1903 plan, the sources for the heritage roses, the work of recovering the original planting schemes from Lady Ashworth's records. It was a thorough account, and she wrote it with care. At the end of that section, she added a single sentence that she had written and removed 3 times before deciding to include it. The walled garden is, in the opinion of the estate manager, the most significant horticultural feature of the North Estate, and its restoration represents the work of which the estate has most reason to be proud. She sent the report to Mr. Lane, who would give it to Lord Ashworth. She did not know if he would read the whole of it, or only the accounts section, or simply file it as received. She had written it as though it would be read carefully. She always did. February was the month when the estate went deepest into winter, the month when the glasshouse seedling work was most intensive and the outdoor work most limited, and the days were short enough that she was sometimes writing her evening notes by lantern while the dark came at 4 in the afternoon. She did not find this hard. She found it simply the way things were. She tended her seedlings. She ordered the last of the spring supplies. She reread Lady Ashworth's records from the spring sections, refreshing her understanding of the timing of things in the northern climate, the adjustments that were needed compared to what any general manual would suggest. She thought about April. She thought about it the way she thought about a planting plan, practically, with attention to timing and conditions, making sure the various elements would be ready. She was not anxious about Lord Ashworth's visit. She was prepared, which was a different thing entirely. George had reset the lower terrace steps in January, choosing a calm, dry week when the frost had lifted. He had done it without assistance, which had surprised her and not surprised her. George was the kind of man who did things that needed doing without requiring an audience for the doing of them. The steps were solid now. She had checked them herself. The east wing was ready. Mrs. Polly had it as it was, as she had promised. The small corner sitting room with the two-sided view was clean and warm and had on its desk a small vase of stems from the dried flower arrangement that Mrs. Polly kept in the kitchen, rosemary from the lower terrace, a spray of winter berries, a few sprigs of the lavender she had dried in bunches through the summer. Not elaborate, just present, just a sign that someone had thought about the room. March came, and with it the first real warmth. Clara was in the walled garden on a morning in the second week of March when the first of the tulips from the south wall bed pushed through the soil. She knelt and looked at it, a single green tip, neat and determined, no bigger than her little finger. She wrote it in the notebook, first tulip emergence, south wall base bed, 14 March. Then she straightened up and looked at the south wall with all its rose growth thickening daily in the warmth, and the east wall where the sweet pea seeds she had planted inside were already germinating on the glasshouse bench, and the bench on the north wall with the morning light on it, and the whole enclosed space smelling of soil and early growth, and the particular promise that March in a walled garden carries, the sense that everything is about to begin. 3 weeks, she thought. 3 weeks, and Lord Ashworth would come through that gate. She wanted it to be ready for him, not performed, not arranged to impress, just genuinely ready, the way a person is ready when they have done their work and done it honestly and can look at the result without apology. She walked the south wall, she touched the rose growth, she checked the raised herb bed, she looked at the iron hooks in the walls, all of them now, including the new ones, dressed with the beginnings of new growth or ready for it. All those small deliberate choices still there, still working. She went back to the glass house to check on the sweet pea seedlings. April was coming, the garden was ready. He arrived on a Tuesday. Mrs. Polly had been watching for the car since 9 in the morning, though she had said nothing about doing so. Clara knew, because she could hear the particular quality of stillness in the kitchen that meant Mrs. Polly was listening for something rather than simply working. Clara was in the estate office when she heard the gravel, the slow crunch of a car moving up the drive at the pace of someone looking as they went. She did not go to the window. She finished the line of accounts she was writing, capped her pen and set the notebook aside. Then she stood up and went to the front door. She had imagined, without meaning to, what he might look like. The paintings were from 1988 when he had been 27, and she had the angular handwriting from 2 letters. She had built something out of those fragments and the things George and Mrs. Polly had told her over the course of a year and a half, and whatever she had built in her imagination was immediately and entirely replaced when she opened the front door. He was in his mid-50s. He was not as tall as she had somehow pictured. He had the kind of face that had probably been conventionally good-looking in its youth, and had become, with age, more interesting, the lines in it carrying the evidence of thought and time rather than just years. He wore a coat that was practical without being casual, and he carried no luggage because there was a driver behind him lifting it from the boot of the car. He walked up to the front step and looked at her. "Miss Webb," he said. "Lord Ashworth," she said, "welcome." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was direct and slightly difficult to read, not unfriendly, but not performing friendliness either. He was not the kind of man who filled spaces with social ease. She had suspected this from the letters, and she was not surprised to find it confirmed. "I went around the formal garden from the car," he said, "the lavender on the western walk. We planted 92 plants last spring," she said, "the same variety Lady Ashworth used. It's in its 2nd season now, so the growth is stronger." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once, a precise and deliberate nod that seemed to be acknowledging something beyond the factual statement she had made. "I should like to see the grounds before anything else," he said, "if you are available." "I am," she said. "Please come in briefly and then we will go out." Mrs. Polly was in the front hall. She had her hands folded in front of her and her back entirely straight, and she looked at Lord Ashworth in a way that was neither servile nor bold, but simply honest, the look of someone who has waited a long time for something, and is now having to decide how to feel about the fact of it finally arriving. Lord Ashworth looked at her, his expression changed, something in it became less contained. "Polly," he said. He used just the last name, the way she was used to being addressed, but with a quality in it that was not purely formal. "My lord," she said, "I'm very glad you're here." That was all. She went to the kitchen to bring tea. Lord Ashworth followed Clara into the sitting room, where the fire was going, and accepted the chair she indicated and sat in it with the posture of someone who is in a familiar room that has become unfamiliar, a slight adjustment, a recalibration. "The paintings," he said. He was looking at the wall above the fireplace, where Clara had in March hung the one she had kept rolled in the tube, the stone bench painting, the full walled garden behind it. She had put it there after thinking about it for a long time because it was the most complete of the 3, and because the wall above the sitting room fireplace was where the light fell best. "I thought it suited that position," she said. He looked at it for a long time. He said nothing. Mrs. Polly brought tea. He took his cup and held it but did not immediately drink, still looking at the painting. "I did not know those were still here," he said. "Mrs. Polly found them during the preparation of the east wing," Clara said. "I mentioned them in a letter." Yes, he finally looked away from the painting. You said they were undamaged. They are. We kept the other two in the estate office. I'll show you when we come back in. He drank his tea. He asked, in the practical tone of a man who has been managing estates at a distance for a decade and is now trying to recalibrate to proximity, several questions about the accounts and the scheduled work for the spring. Clara answered them precisely. They had a businesslike conversation for 15 minutes, which felt to her like a man getting his footing before he was ready to feel anything. She understood that. She was patient with it. When he stood up and said he was ready to see the grounds, she put on her coat and led him out. She took him through the formal garden first. The April formal garden was not the dramatic spectacle it would be in summer. The roses were in early growth, the lavender in its silver-green pre-flowering state, the borders showing the clear structure that spring reveals before the fullness of the season fills it in. But it was honest. It showed the bones of the work, the care in the planting positions, the rightness of the proportion. He walked beside her and listened to what she told him about the borders and asked precise, knowledgeable questions that confirmed he understood gardens properly. He knew the names of plants. He noticed what she had done with the drainage, specifically. He noticed that the lawn area was not waterlogged, and he said so, and she told him about the drainage repair, and he asked about the method. They were talking about plants and ground conditions. They were also walking through the formal garden of a house he had not been to in 11 years, and every few steps the professional conversation paused for a fraction of a second as something caught his attention or something shifted in his face, and then the conversation resumed. She did not draw attention to those pauses. She let them happen and talked around them. They went through the yew hedge gate. She showed him the lower terrace, the steps George had reset, the climbing hydrangea on the bank, the herb bed with the rosemary in its 3rd year since the cutting, already substantial. She watched his face when he saw the view from the lower terrace. He stood at the edge and looked out at it, the slope of fields, the line of trees on the horizon, the sky over the north country carrying its particular kind of light, and he was still for longer than he had been still at anything else. "My wife used to have tea here," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Mrs. Polly told me. I have been keeping the furniture down here when the weather allows." He looked at her. "She mentioned it in the records," he said. Not a question. He was connecting the detail she had provided to its source. "She kept very thorough records," Clara said. "She kept records of everything," he said. There was something in that which was not quite grief and not quite fondness, and was perhaps both of those things in an arrangement that had been living alongside each other for a long time and had reached a kind of equilibrium. They went back up the steps and around to the walled garden. Clara unlocked the door. She had the key on her own ring now, had moved it there in November, and pushed it open and stepped back to let him go through first. She watched from the doorway. He walked in slowly. He stopped in the center of the garden and turned, the way visitors turned, taking in the walls, the climbing roses, the central path, the fountain. The fountain was playing. She had timed it again as she had for the society visit. The water sound in the walled garden in April morning light, the smell of the soil and the early tulips and the fresh growth on the rose canes. It was everything the space was capable of being in this season. He turned toward the south wall. The old blush rose was not yet in flower, too early, the buds still tight. But the growth was long and strong and well-trained, the new canes arching beautifully, the foliage a deep clear green. And at the base of the south wall in the raised bed, the tulips were open deep and jewel-like in the morning light, the colors Lady Ashworth had chosen for this bed, dark red, pale yellow, a particular violet rose that was the color of the light at the end of a clear day. He stood and looked at the south wall and the tulips for a long time. Then he looked at the iron hooks in the wall, all along the wall, the new ones matching the old ones precisely. Clara said nothing. After a while she heard him breathe, just a breath, slightly unsteady, immediately controlled. Then he walked to the stone bench on the north wall and sat down on it and looked at the south wall from there. He did not say anything for a long time. Clara walked to the raised herb bed and crouched beside it and checked the moisture of the soil, because there was always something that needed checking, and because giving him the space of practical occupancy on her part was the most respectful thing she could think to do. "The rosemary," he said. His voice was level again. "The 3rd plant from the left," she said without turning, "grown from the same original stock as the one Lady Ashworth had here. A cutting from the botanical garden in the valley. They had received a cutting from this estate 20 years ago and kept it going. I wrote to them in January of last year. Silence. Then, you wrote to a botanical garden to recover a cutting of a specific rosemary that had been here. It seemed important, Clara said. She stood up and brushed her hands together. The records mentioned she had grown it for many years before she brought it here, and that she was concerned about losing it. It seemed worth the effort to find it again. He was quiet for so long that she finally turned and looked at him. He was sitting on the stone bench, Lady Ashworth's bench, the warmest seat on the estate, and he was looking at the rosemary plant with the expression of a man who has been holding something tightly for a long time and has just been surprised into setting it down for a moment. He caught her looking. He cleared his throat. The soil amendments along the south wall base, he said. You mentioned potassium-rich compost in the accounts. Which supplier? She told him. They talked about compost suppliers for 3 minutes. The practical conversation wrapped around whatever had just happened in the air between them, and Clara was grateful for it, and she thought he probably was too. He was at the estate for 4 days. Clara had planned for 2, which was what his letter had suggested. After the first day, over dinner at the long table in the dining room that Mrs. Polly had set with the silver she had kept polished through the years, he said, I think I will stay through the week if that suits you. It suited her, she told him so. Mrs. Polly heard this from the kitchen and was quiet for the rest of the evening, in the way she was quiet when something was exactly right. The 4 days took on a rhythm that Clara had not expected. Each morning he was up early. She could hear him moving in the east wing before she came downstairs, and by the time she was ready to go out he was already in the estate office, looking at something from the records or the maps she had pinned to the board. He looked at those maps for a long time on the second morning. She came in to collect her notebook and found him standing at the board with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the estate plan she had drawn in her first month, a hand-drawn map showing every section of the grounds, color-coded by condition as of her arrival, with notations in her small handwriting. She had forgotten the color coding, the original state of everything marked in red. She had not updated the map because she had been working too closely with it to want to change it. She used it as a reference point, a reminder of where things had started. He was looking at the red markings. The whole formal garden, he said, not an accusation, just a statement of what the map showed. When I arrived, yes, she said, I've kept the original assessment map as a reference. I can show you the current state in comparison. I have the updated notes in the files. No, he said. He turned from the map. That is not necessary. I can see the current state by walking through the garden. He paused. I meant that I understand what you were given to work with. She said nothing. The drainage on the north field was already listed as a problem in 1998, he said. I remember seeing a letter about it from the second manager. I approved a budget for it. He spent the money and the problem remained. The pipe was collapsed, Clara said. Not blocked. It needed to be replaced rather than cleared. It's been replaced. He nodded. I know, he said. I read the accounts. He had read all the accounts, all the monthly reports. She understood that now. The brief 3-line responses from Mr. Lane had not meant a lack of attention. They had simply been his way of acknowledging what was being said without opening up an extensive correspondence he was not yet ready for. She thought about all the careful reports she had written, the precise language she had used, the way she had described the walled garden restoration in the January annual report. He had read all of it. She went out to the garden and left him with the maps. On the 3rd day he asked if he could accompany her on the morning walk. She said yes. They walked the full circuit of the grounds together. He asked questions throughout, specific, knowledgeable, and sometimes very precise questions that showed he understood what he was looking at in a way that went beyond the general interest of an estate owner. He knew the names of things. He noticed the things she had done that were not obvious to a casual observer, the way she had managed the yew hedge renewal, which required cutting back to brown wood and trusting the plant to regenerate, which it had. The way she had composted the walled garden beds in layers, the particular variety of thyme she had planted at the north end of the raised bed because it was slightly more cold-hardy than the others. You know the south wall bed will need the tulip foliage left until July, he said, passing it on the morning circuit. I left a note, she said. I saw the note. He looked at her. That was the right instinct. She accepted the comment without expressing pleasure at it, which was not modesty but simply the way she was. She did not need praise in the way some people did. She needed the work to be right. The comment confirmed the work was right, which was satisfying in itself. They reached the gate on the afternoon circuit of the third day, and he stopped and looked at the wisteria, which was in early bud, tight, promising, the heavy clusters beginning to separate at their tips with the faintest suggestion of purple. "Another 3 weeks," she said. "I know," he said, "I've been counting." She looked at him. "I looked up the date this year," he said, "when I received your letter mentioning it." She thought of the letter she had written. "The wisteria is in early bud. I expect it will be as good as last year, which was very good." She had written it without calculation because it was the current and accurate state of the wisteria. She had not been thinking of it as an invitation. She thought about it now and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to add. They stood at the gate. The wisteria buds were above them, the gate post iron dark and solid beside them, the afternoon light from the west making the stones of the drive glow slightly. It was a very fine afternoon for April. "Miss Webb," he said. "Yes, I owe you an apology." She looked at him. He was looking at the gate. "You were sent here as a form of management," he said. The word was careful. "I know how the Southern estate handled this. I was made aware of the arrangement. I said nothing because it was a matter outside my direct involvement." He paused. "That was not right." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You gave me the best post I have ever held," she said. He looked at her. "I mean that precisely," she said. "I do not require an apology, but I will accept the acknowledgement that what was done was not right." He held her gaze. Then he nodded once, the same precise nod she had seen on the first day. "The estate is in extraordinary condition," he said. "What you have done here in 18 months is, I do not have the right language for it." "The estate has extraordinary bones," she said. "Lady Ashworth gave it that. I have been working with what she built." He was quiet for a moment. She had used Lady Ashworth's name directly and easily, as she always did in the estate office and the records room and the walled garden. She did not feel that she had been careless. She felt that the directness was the right approach. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it quietly and without any self-consciousness, as a plain statement of fact based on his knowledge of both people. Clara said, "I have admired her work enormously." They stood at the gate for a moment longer. The evening was coming. The wisteria buds were just visible overhead, patient and accumulating toward their flowering. He said, "I would like to discuss what the estate requires for the next several years. I would like to plan properly, not just approve monthly accounts. I would like to understand the full scope of what you see for this property." "I would welcome that conversation," she said. "Tomorrow morning after the walk." "Yes," she said. After the walk. They went back inside. Mrs. Polly had made a proper dinner, the kind that required the good dining room and the good silver and the candles she kept for significant occasions. She set it without being asked, as though she had known what kind of evening it would be before any of them were quite sure themselves. Clara changed out of her working coat and sat down at the dining table across from Lord Ashworth and ate dinner in the candlelight of the dining room of the North Estate, which smelled of good food and old wood, and faintly, from somewhere in the house, the dried lavender that Mrs. Polly kept in bunches from last summer's harvest on the western walk. The conversation over dinner was not about the garden or the estate accounts. He asked about her background, her training under Fletcher, her years in the South. She answered directly, without performing modesty about her skills or overstating them. He told her at some point about the years in London after Lady Ashworth's death, not the years themselves in detail, but the shape of them, the way a person describes a long, difficult period they have come through and are now looking at from the other side of. She listened. She did not offer sympathy in the form of words that diminish what they are trying to address. She simply listened. By the end of dinner, something had settled between them that was not friendship exactly, too formal still for that, too newly established, but was something honest and specific and built on what was real. She thought it was probably the best foundation for whatever came next, and whatever came next she was fairly sure would be good. After dinner she walked out through the dark garden to the walled garden door and stood for a moment with her hand on the cold iron and looked up at the April sky, clear and very dark, the stars of the north extraordinary in their quantity and brightness. She thought the visit went well. She did not allow herself more than that. She was not given to extravagance in her assessments, even private ones. The visit had gone well. Tomorrow they would have the conversation about the estate's future. She had things to say and she expected he would listen to them as she had listened to him. That was, all things considered, exactly what she had hoped for. She went back inside and said goodnight to Mrs. Polly, who was still in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the particular look of someone who has been waiting patiently to hear how an evening went. "Well," Clara said, "very well, I think." Mrs. Polly's expression did not change, but something in it became warmer. "Good," she said, "the kettle is still hot." Clara sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her notebook and wrote the list for the morning walk, because there was always a list, and the morning would come early, and the garden did not keep to anyone else's schedule. The morning conversation, after the walk as promised, took place in the small corner sitting room of the east wing. His choice, not hers. He had said after breakfast that he preferred to have the meeting in there rather than the estate office. Clara did not ask why. She brought her notebook and her maps and spread them on the desk while he stood at the window with his hands in his pockets and looked out at the view, formal garden on one side, walled garden wall on the other, the wisteria gate just visible at the corner of vision. She understood why he had chosen this room. She had laid the estate plan on the desk, and beside it the 5-year projection she had drawn up in February, not for this meeting specifically, but because she always worked with a 5-year horizon, and she had been putting the projection together as she went through the winter. It was written in her usual clear style, what was needed when, how much, and what the result would be. He came to the desk and stood beside her and looked at the plan without sitting down. He asked questions, she answered them. The conversation was entirely practical and specific, the two of them working through the projection section by section, and it was the clearest professional conversation she had had since arriving at the estate, because she was talking to someone who fully understood what she was telling him and could add to it rather than simply receive it. He had observations that she had not considered. Not corrections, she thought her plan was sound, and she held to it when she believed in it, but additions, perspectives that came from knowing the estate over a longer timeframe than she had. "The south field," he said, looking at the plan. "The boundary wall there runs along the ridge. It was repaired in 1991, but the east section has a particular weakness. There's a drainage issue on the other side of the wall, on the neighboring property, that causes pressure to build up behind the stone when we have a wet winter. I have been dealing with that issue for 30 years. Clara looked at the east section of the south field wall in her projection. She had flagged it for inspection, but had not included it in the 5-year work schedule. "How have you been dealing with it?" she asked. "By writing letters to the neighboring landowner. He is not an unreasonable man, simply not attentive." He looked up from the map. "I would recommend approaching him directly. He responds better to that than to correspondence." She wrote South Wall East Section, neighboring land drainage, direct approach to landowner. "His name is Pemberton," Lord Ashworth said. "He farms the valley to the south. He was at the Agricultural Society's autumn dinner in November if you attend those." "I didn't know about the dinner," Clara said. "I'll attend next year." He looked at her, a slight pause. "You should have been told about it," he said. "I will make sure Mr. Lane provides you with the full list of local engagements. The estate has historically been represented at several annual events." "That lapsed." "Several things lapsed," she said. She said it without criticism, it was simply true. "Yes," he said equally plainly, "they did." They worked through the projection for 2 hours. By the end of it the plan was richer and better than what she had brought to the desk. With his additions incorporated and the points of disagreement, there were two discussed sufficiently that she understood his position and he understood hers, and they had found a version of each that satisfied both of them. He picked up the 5-year document at the end and looked through it. "I would like to increase the annual grounds budget by 30%, he said. She looked at him. "The work you have done in 18 months on the budget you were given is," he stopped. "I should have provided better from the beginning. The increased budget will be effective immediately. I will write to Mr. Lane today." She did not argue with this. She had spent 18 months being careful with a budget that was genuinely tight, and 30% additional would make the next phase of the restoration significantly more achievable. She thanked him precisely and wrote the budget change into her copy of the projection. He set the document down and looked at the window for a moment. the view from the east wing showing the formal garden and the walled garden wall and the distant trees. "I would like to come back in June," he said. She looked at him. "If that is appropriate," he said, slightly more careful. He was, she had noticed, a man who was careful in some areas with the precision of someone who has learned to be. "The garden in June is its best," she said. "The roses in the walled garden, the sweet peas on the east wall, it would be a reasonable time to see it fully." He nodded. "June then," a pause. "I have been considering whether to spend more time here, more than a week at a time. The London work is manageable from a distance in ways it was not when I was younger." Clara said, "The estate would benefit from it." "I know," he said. "I should have—" He stopped again. That kind of stopped sentence was one he used fairly frequently, she noticed. The kind that began with an acknowledgement of something done or not done, and did not finish, because finishing it would require more than the moment could hold. She let them stand unfinished. It seemed the right response. "The east wing is prepared," she said. "Mrs. Polly has it very well." His expression shifted at the mention of Mrs. Polly, a slight softening that told her he had, through those 4 days, been recalibrating something that had to do with the 2 old servants and their years of staying, and what that staying had cost and meant. "She has been here the whole time," he said. "She and George both," Clara said. "Without them the estate records would not exist and the grounds would be in considerably worse condition. George kept the kitchen garden going throughout. Mrs. Polly preserved everything that could be preserved." He was quiet for a long moment. "I should have written to them," he said, "properly, not through Mr. Lane's office. I should have written to them myself." Clara said nothing. That was not her territory to walk on, and she knew it. "I will do so before I leave," he said. It was not said to her. It was said to himself as a commitment. He closed the estate plan and set it on the desk beside the window. He stood for a moment looking at the view. "Miss Webb," he said, "what made you choose the old blush rose for the south wall? You said you found it in the records, but there were other heritage varieties recorded in that bed." She thought about how to answer this honestly. The records showed Lady Ashworth had been concerned about its continuation, about what would happen to it if the cutting she had was ever lost. Something about that concern seemed to make it the most important one to recover. The things she had taken the most care to protect seemed like the right things to prioritize. He turned and looked at her directly. "That is," he said, and then paused. "That is exactly right." He said it simply, without decoration. They were quiet for a moment. "The walled garden," he said. "I would like to. I used to paint in there in the summers." He stopped. "I wonder whether you would have an objection to my— It is a small thing. I used to sketch sometimes when I was in the garden. I am wondering whether I might do so again, on the June visit, if the weather allows." Clara looked at him for a moment. He was asking her permission to sketch in the walled garden of his own estate. She understood exactly why he was asking it, even if it seemed technically unnecessary. The walled garden had become, in some way that was hard to define in practical terms, her space. She had rebuilt it. She tended it. He was asking whether his presence in it with a sketchbook would be welcome or intrusive. "The bench on the north wall gets the best light," she said. "In the afternoon, in June, the south wall light is extraordinary from that position." He looked at her for a moment. Then the corners of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "I know," he said. She nodded once. "June," she said. "June," he confirmed. He left the following morning. The car came early. Mrs. Polly stood at the front door as it had been stood in for generations on the departure of significant people, and George was visible at the edge of the formal garden, doing something practical near the lavender walk, which was his version of being present without performing presence. Lord Ashworth shook Clara's hand at the front door. He looked at her steadily. "The accounts, the reports, everything you have sent to Mr. Lane," he said. "I want you to know I read all of it." "I wrote them as though they would be," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Something in his face had a quality she recognized from the 4 days, the look of someone encountering a kind of plain, unperformative competence that is rarer than it should be, and when encountered is briefly startling. "I know you did," he said. "That was evident." He got into the car. Clara stood at the gate and watched it go down the drive, the newly painted gate, the avenue of trees either side, the car disappearing around the curve of the drive and then the sound of it fading toward the lane. She stood at the gate for a moment after the sound had gone. Then she looked at the wisteria buds above her. Another 2 weeks to full bloom, possibly 3, the season was a little behind. She had been watching their progress each morning. She went inside and found Mrs. Polly at the kitchen table with both hands around a cup of tea and George's chair pulled close to hers. And they were not talking, just sitting together in the way they did when something important had happened, and the immediate response to it was simply to be in the same room. Clara made herself a cup of tea and sat down with them. They sat for a while. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the April morning was clear. "He wrote to us," Mrs. Polly said. "Before he left letters on the hall table." She looked at her teacup. "George's and mine, we haven't opened them yet." Clara nodded. She did not ask about the contents. The letters were not hers to know about. "He's coming back," George said. It was not a question. "In June," Clara said. "He wants to see the walled garden in full summer." George nodded slowly, his large hands wrapped around his cup. "Good," he said. "That's the right time." He looked out the kitchen window at the garden. "The sweet peas will be 3 feet up the east wall by June." "For if the weather is kind," Clara said. "It usually is," George said. "In June it usually is." They finished their tea. Clara washed her cup, and George put on his coat and went out to the lavender walk, and Mrs. Polly went to begin whatever needed beginning that morning. And Clara went to the estate office and opened her notebook and wrote the list for the day, and then turned to the next blank page and began drafting the expanded 5-year projection that the morning's conversation had made possible. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. The work was good. The expanded budget made things she had been waiting for possible immediately. The new items took their places in the timeline with the particular satisfaction of pieces that were always meant to be there and had simply been waiting. When she came to the end of the draft, she read it through once. It was solid work. It would need another pass in the morning when the language had settled, but the shape of it was right. She closed the notebook. She looked at the paintings on the wall, the south wall in full July bloom, the east wall with the sweet peas. She looked at the window through which the April garden was visible, the wisteria buds still accumulating toward their opening. She thought June. She opened her notebook again and wrote one more item on the list: order additional sweet pea seeds, extra for the east wall, deep planting this year, earlier start. Then she closed the notebook and went out to the garden, because there was always work to do and the morning was clear, and the wisteria was getting closer every day. The wisteria opened on the 22nd of April. Clara was in the glass house early that morning when she heard George's voice from the direction of the gate, not calling out, just a low sound, the kind a person makes when they see something that stops them. She put down the watering can and went to the glass house door. The gate was in full bloom. The clusters hung in perfect cascades, the purple so intense it looked almost architectural, like something deliberately constructed rather than grown. The scent reached her even at the distance of the glass house. She walked to the gate slowly, because it deserved to be approached slowly. George was standing in front of it with his hands in his coat pockets and his head tilted slightly back. He looked at the flowers for a long time in silence. Then he said, "3rd week of April." She always said the 3rd week of April. Clara looked at the gate. She took out her phone, the one she used for estate photographs for the records, and photographed it carefully from 3 angles in the morning light. Then she went inside and wrote a short letter. She addressed it directly, as she now did with letters that needed to reach him rather than his office. She wrote, "The wisteria opened this morning, 22 April. It is in very good health and the bloom is exceptional. I have taken photographs for the records. I thought you would want to know." She mailed it that afternoon. She did not expect an immediate reply and did not receive one. But 6 days later a card came, not a letter, a postcard-sized card with his handwriting on it. "Thank you. I'm very glad you told me." She pinned it to the board in the estate office. May was full of work. The expanded budget was already changing things. She had been able to order the materials for the East Terrace restoration, which had been on her long-term list since she first found the terrace in winter, and which she had not been able to address on the previous budget. Patrick and his brother Oliver and a 3rd man from the village, a stonemason named Raymond who worked with a precision that Clara immediately respected, began the work in the 2nd week of May. The East Terrace was smaller than the main formal garden, but its potential was considerable. It sat on the south-facing aspect of the house, and in full restoration would provide the estate with a sheltered outdoor sitting space with direct access from the house. Lady Ashworth's records showed she had been planning to develop it in 1993, the year she died. She had sketched a planting plan. Clara found it in the records room, tucked into the back of the relevant year's ledger, but the work had never begun. Clara spread the sketch on the estate office desk and looked at it for a long time. Then she made her own version, updated for what she knew about the estate's conditions and the current budget, but staying faithful to Lady Ashworth's original composition. She was not building her own vision of the East Terrace. She was completing someone else's, which seemed like the only appropriate thing to do. She discussed the planting plan with George before ordering anything. He looked at it carefully. "She drew this in the summer of 1992, he said. "I remember she was planning it for the following spring. She talked about it that autumn." "The following spring never happened," Clara said. "No," George said. He looked at the sketch. "The wall-trained fig she wanted along the east wall, that's a long project. Figs take years to establish properly in this climate." "I know," Clara said. "I was going to order one this autumn, plant in spring. It won't be showing results for 3 or 4 years, but it will be there." George looked at her. "A long view," he said. "Yes," she said. He handed the sketch back to her. "Order the fig," he said. A month moved forward the way May does in a garden that is well tended, with a pace that feels both urgent and right, every week bringing visible change, the season advancing with the particular abundance that follows a healthy spring. The tulips in the walled garden's south wall bed were finishing, and she left the foliage exactly as she always did. The roses were in their pre-flowering state, the buds tight and forming on the new wood, the scent already beginning to gather in the walled garden on warm afternoons. The sweet peas were climbing the east wall strings, 7 inches up now, beginning to reach with their tendrils for the next level. Patrick had put in the new strings at Clara's direction, more of them than last year, the coverage denser, because she was aiming for the east wall to be entirely covered by the peak of summer. She stood in the walled garden on a warm May evening after the day's work was done and looked at the east wall with its strings and the reaching sweet peas and thought, "In 4 weeks, in the right conditions, the whole wall will be scented." She stayed in the garden until the light went. She sat on the bench, Lady Ashworth's bench, and watched the south wall roses close down for the evening in the way roses do, the petals drawing slightly in. The fountain played. The smell of the evening garden, rich and complex, was all around her. She thought about the fact that in 4 weeks Lord Ashworth would be here and would sit on this bench and see the walled garden in its full June expression. And she felt something she could not have named accurately, but that was close to the feeling of having done a very difficult thing correctly. Not pride exactly, something quieter than that. The satisfaction of work that was honest and careful and had produced what it was supposed to produce. She thought about Mrs. Polly sitting in the records room on Sunday evenings writing entries in the planting ledgers and Lady Ashworth bringing her tea. The precision of those records, the care in every observation. The decades of attention that had made the garden what it was when it was at its height, and the records that had made it possible to bring it back. She thought about the iron hooks in the walls, all those small, deliberate, careful decisions. She looked up at the hooks along the south wall, each one now carrying the weight of rose canes trained along the wires, the whole wall organized and intentional in the way it had been designed to be. The hooks had waited 11 years for someone to use them again. They were being used now. Clara sat on the stone bench in the May evening until the first stars appeared over the top of the walled garden's north wall, and she thought about all the things that had to hold true in exactly the right order for her to be sitting here, the rusted gate, and the assignment nobody wanted, and the records room with its carefully preserved boxes, and the cold November mornings working on drainage, and all the winter seed catalogues spread on the kitchen table, and Mrs. Polly's hand holding out the key. And she thought, "I am glad I came here. I am profoundly glad I came here." She did not say it. She sat with it privately, the way she sat with most important things. Then she stood up, because the night air was cool and tomorrow was an early start, and the East Terrace stonework needed checking before Raymond began the next phase in the morning. She walked back through the walled garden and out through the gate and across the dark garden to the house, where the kitchen light was on, and Mrs. Polly was doing her usual last round of the house before going to bed, the click of her footsteps moving through the rooms in their familiar pattern. Clara went into the kitchen and put the kettle on, and when Mrs. Polly came in 5 minutes later, Clara already had 2 cups on the table. "I thought you were out in the garden," Mrs. Polly said. "I came in," Clara said. "How is the east wing? The bedroom, the chimney was swept again last week. Is the flue drawing properly?" "Perfectly," Mrs. Polly said. She sat down and wrapped both hands around the tea. "Everything is perfectly ready." June was 4 weeks away. The garden was not holding its breath. Gardens do not hold their breath. They simply grow with or without an audience at whatever rate the season and the soil and the care given them allows. But Clara, walking through it every morning, felt something in it that was as close to anticipation as a garden can express, the particular quality of a living thing that is at the height of its preparing and is nearly, not quite yet but nearly, ready. She kept the mornings to herself. She kept the lists and the notebooks and the early hours of the day. She kept the walled garden walks and the fountain sound and the bench with the south wall light. Everything else she shared freely, the work, the plans, the hours, the care. But the mornings in the walled garden were hers, and they sustained everything else, and she understood that very clearly and was grateful for it. He came back on the 1st of June, as promised. This time Clara did not hear the car on the gravel first. She was in the walled garden, where she spent most mornings now in the early summer season, and she did not know he had arrived until she heard the gate open and looked up. He was alone. He had left the driver with the car at the front of the house, apparently, and walked directly to the walled garden, which meant he had walked around the outside of the house and along the path between the yew hedge and the east wing, which was not the most obvious route unless you already knew where the walled garden entrance was. He was carrying a flat leather case. She recognized it from the paintings in the estate office, the kind of case an artist carries. She had looked at those paintings enough times to recognize the proportions of the case, even though it had not been visible in any of the paintings themselves. She was crouching near the south wall base when he came through the gate. She stood up. "I should have told you what time I was arriving," he said. "It doesn't matter," she said. He looked at the south wall. The roses were in full bloom. The old blush was open in its characteristic clusters of deep rose pink, the flowers informal and generous, filling the air of the walled garden with the scent that was different in June than at any other time, richer, warmer, layered with the herbs from the raised bed and the beginning of the sweet peas on the east wall, which were 3 weeks into their flowering now and climbing the strings in a cascade of white and pink, and the particular dark violet that Lady Ashworth had favored. He stood and looked at the south wall for a long time. She went back to what she had been doing, checking the moisture level of the herb bed soil, which was her morning task for this section of the garden. She gave him the space of her practical presence. After a while she heard him sit down on the bench. She heard the leather case being set down, then silence. She finished the herb bed check and moved to the adjacent section of the path to examine the edging, which Patrick had done last week, but which she always verified herself, because the edges of a walled garden path set the tone of everything inside it. "The sweet peas," he said. "East wall," she said. "George and I followed the same approach as the original planting, seed grown inside from early March, planted out end of May, strings tied at intervals. We increased the coverage this year. More strings, more plants." She heard him stand up. She heard him walk toward the east wall. She looked up. He was standing at the east wall with the sweet peas around him, the lower strings fully covered now, the scent of them immediate and sweet, the colors ranging from white through every shade of pink and rose to the deep violet. He was looking at the wall with an expression that was not managed at all. He was looking at it with his face open in the way a person's face goes when they are entirely inside a memory. Clara looked back at the path edging and checked the last section carefully, and made a note in her notebook and put it away. He came back to the bench and sat down and opened the leather case. Inside, she saw from the corner of her vision, were pencils and a small sketchbook. He opened the sketchbook to a blank page and looked at the south wall. She went to the fountain. There was a small adjustment needed to the flow rate. She had been watching it for 3 days, wanting to slow the main jet slightly so the sound was fuller and less splashy. She made the adjustment now with the tool she kept in the bed nearby, a small wrench. The fountain's sound changed, slightly lower, rounder, better. "That is better," he said. "Yes," she said, "I've been working on it." She heard the soft sound of pencil on paper begin. She worked in the walled garden for another hour. She was quiet, he was sketching. The fountain played. The roses moved very slightly in the small warm air currents of the enclosed space. The sweet peas on the east wall held their color and their scent. When she was ready to move on to the next section of her morning circuit, she looked at him and said, "I'm going to the lower terrace. If you'd like to see the progress there, or you can stay here." He looked up from the sketchbook. "I'll come to the terrace later," he said. "I would like to stay here a while." "Of course," she said. "The door locks from the inside. There's a bolt, if you want privacy." He looked at her for a moment. "I do not need that," he said, "but thank you." She went out through the walled garden gate and along the path to the lower terrace, where Raymond the stonemason had completed the stone flag's restoration and left the surface clean and level and good. Patrick had done the first planting of the terrace beds, the thyme and the rosemary and the hardy herbs along the base of the bank, and they were settling in well, the rosemary already putting on new growth after the transplant. She stood on the lower terrace and looked out at the view. The June fields below the estate wall, the distant trees, the sky. She stood there for a few minutes with the sun on her face, which was the right thing to do on the lower terrace in June, because this was the seat with the best view and you were supposed to use it. Then she went back up the steps, solid now, George's work, and continued her morning circuit. He was still in the walled garden when she came back to the path that ran alongside the walled garden wall an hour later. She could hear the fountain through the wall. She did not go in again. She went on with the morning. At 11 he appeared at the kitchen door where she was going over the accounts with Mrs. Polly, the leather case under his arm. "Can I show you something?" he said. She went to the sitting room where he had spread 2 sketches on the table. One was of the south wall as he had seen it that morning, the roses in bloom, the herb bed below, the wall itself with its trained canes and iron hooks. The other was a smaller study, just the bench, the north wall behind it, the fountain at the corner of the frame. He had drawn with the same quality that was in the paintings on the estate office wall, the attention of someone looking at something they were genuinely seeing, not documenting but comprehending. "These are very good," she said. "The south wall is better than I remembered," he said. He was not speaking about the sketches. "It is its second full summer," she said. "The roses are 3 years old from the cutting, they're just properly established now." He looked at the sketch of the south wall. "She had them trained higher," he said. "The original training, they went all the way to the top of the wall." "I know, the records show it. I've been training them upward since the first spring. By next summer they should reach." He was quiet for a moment. "Next summer," he said. "It takes time," she said. "Roses don't hurry." He looked at her and the corners of his mouth moved in the way she had seen once before in April. Not quite a smile but the shape of one, and considerably warmer than his usual expression. "No," he said, "they don't." That afternoon, after a lunch that Mrs. Polly had made with the particular thoroughness she brought to things when they mattered, he asked whether she would walk with him to see the glass house and the kitchen garden. She took him through both, and he asked the practical questions that he always asked: what variety, what method, what result, and she answered them. But the quality of the afternoon was different from the April visit, which had been contained and careful in the way of 2 people establishing the terms on which they understood each other. This was less contained, not informal exactly. He was never informal in the way of someone who has shed all formality, but there was something easier in it. She found herself saying things she would have framed more precisely in April, and he received them without requiring the precision. In the kitchen garden, George was harvesting early lettuces. He nodded to Lord Ashworth, and Lord Ashworth stopped, and they had a brief conversation about the kitchen garden expansion, the new beds, the variety of what was growing, the compost system. George talked to him differently than she had ever heard him talk to anyone outside the household, directly, with a tone that was not exactly equal but was certainly not deferential, and that communicated, in the particular language of men who both understand working land, a kind of mutual respect that required no ceremony. She watched them talk and thought, "Good, this is right, this is how it should work." In the evening, over dinner again at the long table, he told her he had been in correspondence with the Northern Heritage Trust. The January annual report, the one with the full account of the walled garden restoration and its history, had been forwarded to the trust by Miss Vane, who was apparently a committee member. The trust had written to him to inquire whether he would be interested in applying for a heritage listing for the walled garden. Clara looked at him. "A listed garden," she said. "The trust believes the 1903 plan, combined with the documented continuous history of the planting and the quality of the restoration, makes a strong case, he said. It would come with some obligations in terms of access and record keeping, and certain protections in terms of what changes can be made to the structure. Clara thought about this. It would also, he said, provide access to additional grant funding for maintenance and further restoration. The East Terrace planting, she said. Among other things. She considered it. The access requirements, how many days per year would the public need to be received? The Trust suggests 12, which would align with the Heritage Society program, and 2 or 3 additional open days. She thought about what 12 open days would mean in practical terms. The visitor path, the guides, the signage she had already noted as a future need. It's manageable, she said. I think so too, he said, but I wanted your assessment before I responded. She looked at him across the dinner table. The candlelight, the silver Mrs. Polly had polished twice in 2 months now, the painting visible on the sitting room wall through the open door, the south wall roses in full July bloom from 1988. The garden should be seen, she said. Lady Ashworth opened it to the society twice. She would have wanted people to see it. Yes, he said, she would. He wrote to the trust the following day. He drafted the letter in the estate office, which Clara was not using in the morning, and she saw it on the desk when she came in after the morning walk. He had left it there for her to read before it was sent, which was not something he had said he would do and which she took as a considered choice. She read it. It was well written and clear and said everything that needed to be said. She went to find him in the East Wing and said, I have read it. It is the right answer. He sent it that afternoon. He stayed for 6 days this time. On the 4th day she came into the estate office in the morning to find him already there, standing at the board looking at the 5-year projection plan she had posted there after their April meeting. He had a pencil in his hand and had been making small notations in the margin. She could see, though he stepped back when she came in. I am sorry, he said, I should have asked. You own the estate, she said. You do not need to ask. He looked at her. I have been thinking about something, he said. I would like to discuss it if now is not inconvenient. She sat down at the desk. He stood at the board, which was where he was comfortable thinking, she had noticed. The heritage listing will change the character of the estate somewhat, he said. The open days, the additional attention. I want to make sure the management structure supports that properly. At the moment everything runs through you and Mr. Lane, and Mr. Lane is fundamentally a London administrator. He paused. I have been considering whether the estate needs a more formal management arrangement, a clearer structure, a recognition of what the role actually requires. Clara listened. What I am proposing, he said, is a formal head manager position for the estate, not estate manager, which is the title you currently hold and which is somewhat ambiguous in practice. Head of estate, sole reporting authority, full budget control, the ability to hire and direct staff without requiring London approval for each decision. She looked at him. And an appropriate contract and compensation structure to match, he said, which I should have established from the beginning. Clara was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the letter from Lord Hargrove's study. The word outstanding said twice, Clifford Hale and his connections. I am satisfied with the work I do here, she said carefully. I know, he said. What you deserve is to be satisfied with the terms under which you do it as well. She looked at the 5-year projection on the board, her handwriting, her planning, 2 years of thought made visible. I would like to continue the restoration as I have planned it, she said. The East Terrace, the South Field boundary wall, the kitchen garden expansion in year 3. The long-term project in the upper field that I have sketched but not yet formalized. All of it, he said, with appropriate resources. And the record-keeping, she said. Lady Ashworth kept records of everything. I have continued that. Those records are as important as the garden itself. They are what allows the garden to be understood over time, to be restored if it is ever damaged, to be known by whoever comes after. I want formal recognition that the records are part of the estate's essential maintenance, not an optional addition. He looked at her steadily. I will have Mr. Lane draw up a contract that includes that specifically, he said. She nodded once, then yes, she said, I accept. He held out his hand, she shook it. His grip was firm, the handshake brief and direct. Good, he said. He sounded slightly relieved, which was the most unguarded she had seen him be about anything outside the walled garden. She discovered over the course of the following hour, equally relieved in the private, contained way she experienced most things. The work had been right from the beginning. The terms of it now matched the work. On the 5th day, she took him to the upper field. The upper field was the section of the estate she had written least about in her reports and talked about least with anyone. It was at the highest point of the property, accessed through a gate in the north boundary wall, a wide sloping piece of land with exceptional views in all directions. Lady Ashworth's records showed it had been used as a wildflower meadow in the 1980s. She had mentioned it twice, once noting the planting of a native seed mix and once recording a particularly good year for oxeye daisies. In its current state it was rough pasture, not managed, the wildflower element long gone but not entirely beyond recovery. Clara had been thinking about it since the spring. She had a plan for it. She had not put it in the formal 5-year projection because she wanted to see it first with someone whose knowledge of the estate went deeper than hers before she committed to the direction. They walked up through the north gate in the morning. The view from the upper field was the best on the estate, better even than the lower terrace. You could see 4 or 5 miles in any direction, the north country rolling away to hills on the far horizon, the estate spread out below with the walled garden wall visible, and the house and the formal garden and the lavender walk a stripe of silver green. He stood at the top of the slope and looked out at it and was very still. She loved this field, he said. The records mention it, Clara said, the wildflower planting. She came up here in the evening sometimes, he said, especially in high summer. She said the light up here lasted longer than anywhere else on the estate. There's something in the angle of the slope. Clara looked at the slope. He was right, it would catch the late evening sun at an angle that the garden level would have already lost. I want to restore the wildflower element, she said. Not exactly as it was, I don't have enough detail from the records to know precisely what she planted, but the principle, a managed native meadow, annual scything in late summer, which is good practice for the wildflowers, some additional plug planting of key species in the first 2 or 3 years to accelerate the recovery. He was looking at the view. It would take time, he said. 3 years for the meadow to establish properly, she said, 5 to see it at its best. But I would start this autumn with the first seed mix on the lower section, and we would see results within 2 growing seasons. He was quiet for a while. The upper field wind moved around them. Start this autumn, he said. Yes, she said. He turned from the view and looked at her. I want to be here when it flowers for the first time, he said. That would be the summer after next, she said, at the earliest. I know, he said, I'll be here. She noted this. Not in her notebook, she simply noted it, in the way she noted things that mattered, and she carried it back down the slope with her along with the upper field plan and the view and the late daylight that she now understood was the whole point of standing there. The last evening of his June visit was the warmest of the 4 days. Clara was in the walled garden after supper when he came through the gate with his sketchbook. He did not say anything. He sat on the bench with the sketchbook and the pencil and began working. She was tending the sweet pea strings, weaving the new growth through the supports, which needed doing gently and with attention because sweet pea stems are fragile and snap if you hurry. The fountain played, the roses held their evening warmth, the sweet peas in full summer flower scented the air of the walled garden in the particular way that sweetens the end of a June day. She worked her way along the east wall slowly, weaving and supporting, and he sketched on the bench, and no one said anything for a long time. Then he said, "What is the largest project you have not yet started?" She thought about it. "The upper field," she said, "the long term." "What else?" "The espalier fruit on the south wall of the kitchen garden. The structure is there, but it needs completely rebuilding from new trees. Apples and pears. It would take 10 years to be at its best." "Plant the trees," he said. "I intended to," she said. "I know," he said. "I meant that I wanted to say it." She looked at him from the east wall. He was looking at the sketchbook, his pencil moving. She looked back at the sweet peas. "The orchard in the lower field," she said. Lady Ashworth's records mention an orchard in the lower field as something she wanted to restore. It was in the estate in the early 20th century and removed when the field was converted to pasture. "I know about the orchard," he said. She talked about it. "It's a very long project," Clara said. 15 years before an apple orchard is established. "This estate is 400 years old," he said. 15 years is not a long time. She considered that. It was, she thought, exactly the right way to think about it. "I'll draw up a plan," she said. "Good," he said. The evening deepened. The walled garden held its warmth as it always did, releasing it slowly into the cooling air, the stone working as it had been designed to work for 120 years. The iron hooks held the rose canes. The fountain played its small clear sound. The sweet peas, thoroughly supported, nodded in the last of the light. Clara finished the east wall and walked to the south wall to check the evening state of the roses, the petals drawing in slightly, the scent thickening as it always did at dusk. She looked at the full wall, the coverage, the trained canes carrying the bloom. Nearly to the top of the wall, by next summer they would be there. She looked at the stone bench, and the man on it who was sketching by the last of the evening light with the concentration of someone who has found, again, something they had lost. She went to the fountain and checked the flow rate one more time, a small adjustment, everything as it should be, and then she walked to the gate. "Good night," she said. He looked up. "Good night, Miss Webb," he said. She went through the gate and pulled it closed behind her and walked back through the garden in the warm dusk, and the sound of the fountain followed her for a while before the garden absorbed it. She went inside and made her notes for the day. She wrote the list for the morning. She included at the bottom, "Begin planning the orchard, long-term project, lower field, heritage varieties, target start autumn year 4. Then she put down the pen and looked out of the office window at the June night, which was long and dark blue and faintly starred, and she felt something that she recognized without needing to name it. The deep, plain satisfaction of work that is exactly what it should be, and a life that is being lived in the right place. She went to bed. She slept well. She was up with the light. The heritage listing was confirmed in September. The letter came from the Northern Heritage Trust and was addressed to Lord Ashworth at the estate, which meant it arrived on a Tuesday morning when he was in London, and Clara signed for it and put it on the estate office desk and called Mr. Lane to inform him of the arrival. Mr. Lane called Lord Ashworth. Lord Ashworth called the estate directly, the first time he had ever telephoned rather than written, and asked Clara to read him the relevant sections. She read them. The Trust had confirmed the walled garden as a listed historic garden under their regional program, with effect from the 1st of October. The listing covered the garden's structure, the original 1903 boundary walls, and the planting design as documented in the estate records. The documentation submission Clara had prepared, which included Lady Ashworth's original planting ledgers, the 1903 plan, and the full restoration record she had compiled over 2 years, had been described by the Trust Committee as one of the most thorough and well-evidenced submissions we have received. He was quiet on the telephone for a moment, then he said, "That is very good news." "Yes," she said. Another pause. "The record submission, you compiled that over the winter, I assume?" "Over both winters," she said. "I began organizing the documentation in the first winter and added to it each season as the restoration progressed. The Trust wanted a complete picture from original design to present day." He said Lady Ashworth would have been, and then he stopped and did not finish the sentence. "She waited. She would have been very pleased," he said. "I believe so," Clara said. They said goodbye and she put the telephone down and looked at the listing letter on the desk. She would frame it and put it in the records room, which was where the estate's formal records lived and where it belonged, not in the estate office, the records room. She got up and went to find Mrs. Polly. Mrs. Polly was in the east wing, turning over the rooms again in preparation for what had become a regular arrival. Lord Ashworth came to the estate now at intervals that felt natural rather than scheduled. September had been one of those visits. He would come in October as well. He had said at some point in August that he was working toward spending the better part of spring and summer at the estate, managing the London work from a distance on the days he was needed there, and returning to the north when he was not. Clara had received this information with the same practical acknowledgement she gave most things. She had updated the household schedule with Mrs. Polly, who had received it with considerably more feeling than she showed. "The listing came," Clara said from the door of the east wing bedroom where Mrs. Polly was straightening the curtains. Mrs. Polly turned. Clara held up the letter. She came to the door and took it and read the relevant sections carefully, moving her lips very slightly with the words as she sometimes did when she was reading something important. Then she handed it back. "I knew it would come," she said. We hoped it would. No, Mrs. Polly said. She picked up the curtain arrangement she had been working on. I knew. From the day you walked through that walled garden gate in November 2 years ago and came back inside and asked me for the planting records. She smoothed the curtain. I knew then. Clara looked at her. You did not say so, she said. I did not want to be wrong, Mrs. Polly said, which was a form of honesty that Clara understood completely. She left Mrs. Polly with her curtains and went back downstairs and out to the garden, because the listing required a practical response as well as a personal one. The open day program for the following year needed to be planned, the visitor pathway needed formalizing, and she had a meeting the following week with Miss Vane about the Heritage Society's spring schedule. She began in the walled garden as she began most significant working days. She walked the perimeter slowly, looking at the October state of everything. The roses were finished for the year, the hips showing richly on the old wood. The sweet peas were done and gone, and the east wall was bare strings again, holding their empty lines in the October air. The south wall bed had its bulb foliage died back now, the winter mulch she had applied last month protecting the bulbs below. The walled garden in October was a garden of bare structure and past color and the knowledge of what was coming. She had learned over 2 full years to love it in every season. But October was particularly honest. It showed you the bones of the thing, the essential architecture, the choices that had been made about space and wall and path stripped of the fullness of summer. The bones were right, they were always right. That was Lady Ashworth's gift. She had built the garden on bones that would outlast any particular planting, any particular season, any particular person who might stand in it. Clara stood at the bench and looked at the south wall and thought about the first winter, the cold mornings clearing this garden by hand, the discovery of the bulbs pushing through the mud, the moment she had understood that the garden was not dead but dormant, the month she had found the 1903 plan tucked in the records room ledger. She had been here 2 years and 2 months. She felt as though she had been here much longer, in the particular way of people who are exactly where they should be. Time does not drag in those circumstances, but it does deepen, becomes more layered, the present always carrying what has come before in a way that makes it richer. She would be here next year, and the year after. She knew this now in the way she knew the soil type in each section of the grounds, and the timing of the wisteria, and the depth to plant the heritage tulip bulbs in the south wall bed. It was simply known. The October open day came 3 weeks after the listing was confirmed. Miss Vane had organized it specifically as a celebration of the listing. 15 trust committee members, 6 journalists from regional and national publications, the county heritage officer, and 38 members of the Northern Agricultural and Heritage Society who had been on the first visit and had returned because, as one of them said when he arrived at the gate, they had been telling people about this garden all year and had wanted to see it again themselves. Harold Brent was among those returnees. He came through the walled garden gate and stopped in the doorway the way Clara had seen him stop in August, and he looked at the October garden with the specific attention of a man who could see, in the bare bones of it, exactly what it had been and would be again. The old blush reached the top of the south wall, he said. Yes, Clara said, this summer. He nodded slowly. I heard, someone wrote about it in the society newsletter. They said the coverage was the finest they had seen on a walled garden south wall in the north. He looked at her. They were right from what I saw in August. I wanted to come back. She showed them through the gardens the full route, which now had proper signage at each section and a printed guide she had written herself, covering the history of the planting, the key varieties, and the restoration work. She had written the guide the way she wrote everything, precisely, without over-explaining, trusting the person reading it to find what was relevant to them. The county heritage officer, a careful woman named Margaret Carr who had been in her role for many years and had seen many listed properties in various states of care, walked with Clara through the walled garden at the end of the visit, when the other guests had moved to the front terrace for the tea Mrs. Polly had organized. I have been in this region for 22 years, Margaret said, looking at the south wall with its October hips and bare-trained canes. I know this estate's history. I know what it looked like 8 years ago when I drove past the gate on an inspection of the neighboring road. Clara waited. What you have done here, Margaret said, the quality of it, the fidelity to the original intention, the documentation. She paused. This is the kind of work that is very rare. I want you to know that. Clara said thank you. She meant it simply and received it simply, which was how she received most things. Margaret looked at her. The Trust will want to use this restoration as a model case for the grant program, she said. Your documentation process especially. I would like to ask, when you are ready, whether you would be willing to speak at the Trust's spring conference about the methodology. Clara said she would consider it and would write to confirm. She was not a person who spoke at conferences as a general matter, but the methodology was sound and worth sharing, and Lady Ashworth's approach to record-keeping deserved to be known more widely. She would consider it seriously. Lord Ashworth arrived on the afternoon of the open day, which she had not known he planned to do. She saw his car come up the drive from the window of the estate office, where she was going over the afternoon's accounts after the guests had left, and she went to the front door. He had the leather case with him. I thought the open day was today, he said. It was this morning, she said. The guests have gone. Good, he said. He looked at the gate, the drive, the house, the October light on the pale stone. I wanted to be here. I was not ready to be here while other people were. She understood that completely. The listing letter is on the records room shelf, she said. I've framed it. He looked at her already. This morning, before the guests arrived. Something in his face, not quite a smile, not quite something else, the expression he had that was several things at once. I'll look at it later, he said. May I go to the garden? Of course, she said. The fountain is running. He walked around the side of the house toward the walled garden path. She watched him go. Then she went back to the estate office and the accounts, because the accounts needed doing and the day was not finished, and there would be time for everything else later. He came to the kitchen for supper, which Mrs. Polly had made without being asked because she had seen the car from the kitchen window and had begun cooking. They ate at the kitchen table, which happened sometimes when the occasion was not formal, and it was better for being informal. George joined them, which was also something that had developed over the recent months, a comfortable loosening of the house's old formalities, not into carelessness but into something more honest. After supper, Lord Ashworth went to the records room. Clara knew because she could hear his footsteps. She had learned the particular sound of different people moving through this house. He was in the records room for a long time. She did not go in. When he came out, he came to the estate office where she was finishing the accounts. She kept records for every month from April 1973, he said. I counted. 242 entries, Clara said. I counted in the first winter. He looked at the paintings on the wall. The south wall in July, the east wall with the sweet peas. The third one, the stone bench painting that she had moved in June to hang between the other two because it belonged with them. You have all three up, he said. They belong together, she said. He looked at them for a long time. The spring conference, he said. Miss Carr's proposal you should accept. The methodology, the way you approach the records, the documentation, the long-view thinking, it is worth sharing. She looked at him. He had spoken to Margaret Carr, apparently, or she had written to him. She would find out which. I was going to accept, she said. Good, he said. He sat down in the chair beside the estate office window, the chair that visitors sat in when they came to talk about the estate, which was the most used chair in the room. He looked out the window at the October dark. I used to walk around this estate as a boy, he said. My grandfather brought me here several times before the property came to the family directly. I remember standing in the walled garden. It was summer. It was very full and warm, and thinking that the person who made this garden must have understood something important that I did not yet understand. Clara listened. When I brought Alina here the first time after we were married, she walked around the whole estate in an afternoon. She said, I know what this place wants to be, and then she spent 20 years finding out whether she was right. He paused. She was right. Clara looked at the accounts she had been working on, then she set the pen down. The upper field, she said, the wildflower meadow, when it establishes in 2 years' time the first summer it flowers properly, I want you to be here for that. He turned from the window and looked at her. I will be, he said. She picked up her pen again. The orchard plan is in the projection folder, she said, on the left shelf. I've added the preliminary tree selection heritage varieties appropriate for this climate and soil. The upper field plan is behind it, the phased approach for the meadow. I'd like your input on both before I finalize them. He stood up and went to the left shelf and took down the projection folder and carried it back to the chair and sat down and opened it. They worked through both plans that evening. the two of them at the estate office desk with the October wind outside the window and the lamplight on the papers, and the three paintings on the wall showing the walled garden in its summer fullness. The roses and the sweet peas and the bench and the fountain, all of it painted by a man of 27 who had sat in the garden and looked at what his wife had made and wanted to keep it. The plans were good, they were made better by the conversation. By the end of the evening the 5-year projection had been extended to 10, which was what the garden required, what the upper field required, what the orchard required, what any garden built on the scale and ambition of this one requires: a long view. The patience to plant things that will not be at their best for years, because you are here and you intend to stay, and the garden is worth the wait. Clara filed the updated projection on the left shelf, in the folder where it lived, beside the estate's other working documents. On the right shelf were the planting records, Lady Ashworth's, and behind them Clara's own, which she had been keeping since her first month in the same small handwriting and the same careful notation. Date, section, what was planted, where sourced, condition after 2 weeks, condition after a month, everything recorded, everything legible, everything preserved for whoever would need it in whatever year that turned out to be. She turned off the office light, she went to bed. In the morning she was up with the light, and she walked the grounds in the October dawn, and everything was as it should be, and the iron hooks on the walled garden walls held their rose canes in the first pale light of the day, and the records room held its years of careful knowledge, and the garden knew the way gardens know that it was tended and that the tending would continue, and that was enough and had always been enough and would be. She wrote the spring conference paper in December, in the evenings when the glasshouse work was done and the house was quiet. She wrote it carefully, the way she wrote everything, but with more attention to the shape of what she was saying than she gave to her estate reports, because a report has a fixed structure and a conference paper has to find its own. The methodology she was describing was not complicated in principle, it was only unusual in practice. She wrote, "The most important tool in a heritage garden restoration is not a spade or a budget or a planting plan. It is an honest record of what was there before, kept without gaps and without interpretation, by someone who understood that future gardeners would need to read it. Everything else follows from that." She read that paragraph back and left it as it was. It was what she meant. She wrote about Lady Ashworth's ledgers. She wrote about the way a precise record of a plant's condition at 2 weeks and 4 weeks and 3 months tells you far more than any general description of the species, because it tells you how that specific plant behaved in that specific place, which is information no textbook can provide. She wrote about the 1903 plan found folded between ledger pages and what it had revealed about the original garden structure. She wrote about the bulbs that had survived 11 years of abandonment because they had been planted deeply, and the records said exactly where they were and how deeply. She wrote about the iron hooks. She wrote, Lady Ashworth had iron hooks installed in the walls of the walled garden at intervals of 18 inches across every available surface. She did this in the late 1970s when she was replanning the garden. By any practical calculation, the hooks she installed were more than the planting coverage of the time required. She was installing hooks for a garden she had not yet grown. She was thinking about what the walls could become, not what they were. That is what the long view looks like in practice. Not patience as a passive quality, but attention extended forward into time, making preparation for what is not yet there. She stopped writing and read that paragraph. She thought about Mrs. Polly keeping the records when no one told her to, because she understood they would be needed. She thought about George keeping the kitchen garden going with the resources available to him, not because it was required, but because a kitchen garden is a living thing, and living things require tending. She thought about the first morning she had stood in the walled garden after unlocking it, turning in the cold to look at all the iron hooks. She added to the paper, the hooks were still there when I arrived. 11 years of the garden being unused, unmaintained, locked. The hooks were still there, waiting. That is the thing about preparation made with good materials and good intention. It holds, it waits, it is ready when the time comes. She finished the paper in early January and sent a copy to Miss Vane and a copy to Margaret Carr at the Trust, and kept one in the estate records, in the records room, in the correspondence file alongside the Society newsletter piece and the Heritage listing letter in its frame on the shelf. Lord Ashworth was at the estate in January for a week, working from the East Wing corner room with its two-sided view, taking calls and managing the London business from a distance as he had said he would. He came down for meals and he walked the grounds each morning, sometimes alone and sometimes with Clara. He had stopped asking whether she was available to walk. She was always available in the morning. This was known. The morning walk was part of the structure of her day, the way the records maintenance was, and the accounts and the weekly circuit of the full estate that she did every Friday regardless of weather. On a January morning when the frost was hard and the low winter sun made the walled garden walls glow with a kind of dry gold light, they walked through the walled garden together in silence, and he stopped at the south wall and looked at the rose canes, dormant and trained against the wall with their iron hook wires, the whole thing stripped to structure, clear in the winter light. "The coverage next summer," he said. "Full wall," she said, "top to bottom, both directions. I've been looking at those upper canes since October. They're well established. They will flower at the top for the first time this year." He stood looking at the wall for a long time. "I want to paint it," he said. "In July when it's full, I want to paint the south wall at full coverage." "The light is best in the afternoon," she said. "The bench gives you the right angle. In July from 2 until 5 is the optimum." He looked at her, something in his face that was simple and clear. "I know," he said. They walked out of the walled garden and back through the formal garden, the lavender walk dormant and silver-gray, the border structure visible under the winter, the bones of 2 years of restoration clear in the January light. At the edge of the formal garden where it met the drive, he stopped and looked back at the house, pale stone, the dark wood of the gate arch, the wisteria bare now but showing the thick established structure of a very long established plant, the buds already forming along every stem, waiting for April. 4 months, he said. "Less than that," she said. "The wisteria watches the temperature, not the calendar. If March is warm enough it may open before April." He looked at the bare stems and the small dense buds. "I will be here when it opens," he said, "whatever month." "I'll let you know when the buds start moving," she said. They walked back to the house. The morning was cold and clear and the estate lay around them in its winter state, stripped and legible, the full structure of the work visible without the covering of summer. The boundary fences were sound, the drainage was working, the glass house was warm and producing, the lower terrace steps were solid, the records room was full and organized, the walled garden was ready for spring, the soil turned and mulched, the bulbs deep below the surface and building slowly what they would become. Clara went to the estate office. She opened her notebook and wrote the list for the day. Then she turned to the next page and wrote the list for the week. Then she turned to the section she kept for long-term planning and looked at the entry she had made in October. Begin orchard planning, heritage varieties, lower field, target start autumn year 4. She picked up her pen and added a note beside it. Advanced timeline, begin survey of lower field this spring. Root stock selection by June. Planting could start autumn this year if conditions allow. She looked at the addition. The timeline was right. The budget, with the increase Lord Ashworth had authorized, made it feasible. The lower field soil survey was something she had already been planning. She had the test kit ordered. It was arriving next week. There was no practical reason to wait for year 4. She confirmed the note. Then she closed the notebook and went to the glasshouse to check on the seedling trays, because the morning work was not done, and the seedlings needed checking, and the day was clear and cold. And the light through the glasshouse glass was the particular quality of January light in the north that she had come to recognize as its own kind of beauty, thin and exact and honest about itself, which she found, when she thought about it, to be exactly the light she would have chosen for the work of the season. She checked the seedlings, she made her notes, she moved to the next tray and began again. Outside, the estate stretched away from the glasshouse in all its winter clarity, every section of it known to her now, every condition understood, every plan already in motion for what the spring would bring and the summer after that and the years that lay ahead of it, each one already present in some form in the projection on the estate office board, and the records on the records room shelves, and the plans in the folders and the notes in the notebook, and the small, particular, deliberate preparations that she made every day, in every season, toward a garden that was always becoming more fully itself. She finished the glasshouse check. She went back outside. The morning light was clear. The frost was beginning to soften under the first warmth of the day. In the walled garden, the south wall held its rose canes in their winter arrangement, all the iron hooks doing their patient work, and the soil below the surface held its bulbs, and the fountain in its basin held the cold sky in reflection, and the whole enclosed space held the memory of every summer it had known and the anticipation of the next one, all of it held, all of it waiting, all of it entirely and precisely ready. Clara Webb walked back to the house with her notebook in her hand. and the list for the day written, and the day's work already begun, and the season ahead already planned, and a life that was exactly what it should be. Useful, attentive, honest, rooted in real things, and pointed always toward the next spring with the kind of confidence that only comes from having done the work and done it well. She went inside, she put the kettle on. The garden could wait 5 minutes. It had waited 11 years. 5 minutes was nothing at all.